Wisconsin State Capitol programming is made possible with support from Quick Trip, Wisconsin Realtors Association, Wisconsin Hospital Association, Wisconsin Counties Association, and Wisconsin Operating Engineers Local 139. Wisconsin Eye is an independent, nonprofit public affairs broadcast network. Watch Wisconsin Eye on Spectrum Channels 995 and 363 and at wisi.org.
Diversity, inclusion, and equity, some now say, have been twisted by proponents who promote racial identity is indispensable and advocate for the abolishment of our long-held values and institutions, including the Constitution. One professor at Portland State University made national headlines when he resigned just this last week, saying, "The university sacrificed ideas for ideology, making intellectual exploration impossible." Professor Boghossian went on to say that the university has transformed a bastion of free inquiry into a social justice factory whose only inputs were race, gender, and victimhood, whose only outputs were grievance and division. He said the same situation is playing out at colleges across our country. As chair of the university's committee, my primary objective is to protect and foster intellectual diversity and curiosity. In an effort to better understand the underpinnings of this issue, I've invited a number of speakers to share their perspective with members of the committee here today. And now we are going to turn to our first speaker. After I call for the roll here of committee members, Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Senator Roth.
Here.
Senator Nass. Here. Senator Staffschild. Senator Fine.
Here.
Senator Darling.
Here.
Senator Larson.
Here.
Senator Erpenbach. Senator Royce. Senator Path.
And what we did here today was kind of an anomaly. We started the committee right on time. And because of that, I know that some legislators are running a tad bit late. So I'm going to ask the clerk, as they join us here today, just to add them to the roll call. And with that, I want to introduce our first speaker, Chris Ruffo from the Manhattan Institute. Christopher F. Ruffo is a senior fellow and director of the Initiative on Critical Race Theory at the Manhattan Institute. He is also a contributing editor at City Journal, where his writing explores a range of issues including critical race theory, homelessness, addiction, crime, and the decline of cities on America's West Coast. Ruffo previously served as executive director at the Documentary Foundation, where he directed 4 films for PBS, including America Lost, which explores life in Youngstown, Ohio, Memphis, Tennessee, and Stockton, California. He is a graduate of Georgetown University and a former Lincoln Fellow at the Claremont Institute for the Study of Statesmanship and Political Philosophy. With that, welcome, Chris. We are glad to have you with us today. I'm just going to put you on hold 1 second, Chris, here, as we don't have audio for you. Just stand by a moment here as we work with our Legislative Technology Service Bureau here to run a couple of diagnostics. Just a moment. It says that you are muted on your end. We still cannot hear you. Yeah, Chris, we still can't hear you. Just stand by a second. We'll get this figured out. It's only been about 1.5 years that we've been doing these kind of virtual things. You would think we'd have it all figured out by now, but as always, there always seems to be one glitch here. So just give us a moment here. I just want to acknowledge that Senator Staffschild has joined us here as well.
Check. 1, 2, 3. Check.
Chris,
1, 2, 3.
Chris, we have you now.
Okay, great.
So,
And
welcome.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here with all of you. It's great to be talking about this issue. And in the interest of time, I know you're all busy. How long would you like me to speak? What's the time frame?
So we have set up for you for about a presentation of about 20 to 30 minutes, and then after that we'll have question and opportunities from the senators for about 20 to 25 minutes.
Great, thank you so much. Well, I think first, it's really important to understand the intellectual lineage of critical race theory. And this is a story that spans really from the mid-1960s to the present. And I think it's important to at least get a taste of it to understand where this ideology comes from, how it's changed over the decades, and then where it stands today, not only in America's higher education institutions, but also, I think, critically and crucially, something that people really care about, how it's then filtered down to K through 12. So the story really starts with critical theory, not critical race theory, but critical theory as a general philosophical framework, which in the United States was pioneered by a German-American philosopher at the University of San Diego named Herbert Marcuse. And his theory, drawing from orthodox Marxism and then changing it, was that the goal of philosophical inquiry, the goal of the university system, is not merely to expose and understand the truth, but to actually change political conditions and usher in a great break with capitalism, a great break with patriarchy, a great break with white domination, etc. And for Marcuse and for his students and disciples, the method of critical theory was to try to grind away and what he called disintegrate the social fabric of a country, an advanced democratic capitalist country like the United States, and then apply extra parliamentary pressure. So circumventing the democratic process where the socialists, Marxists of the time knew they could not win in order to create enough kind of chaotic conditions in order to bring about the revolution. And what we saw in the late 1960s and early 1970s is that many kind of student activists, New Left activists, the Black Panther Party, et cetera, took this to heart. Marcuse famously was the doctoral advisor to Angela Davis. He was influential in the student uprisings in Europe, and also was a close confidant and had appeared publicly with members of the Weather Underground domestic terror organization that over the course of the 1970s conducted a series of bombings at police stations, the homes of a federal state Supreme Court justice, the Pentagon, the U.S. Capitol. And this dialectic, although it burned out by the mid-1970s, retained some purchase among a small set of highly educated, affluent, predominantly white radicals. So what you see is that many of the kind of most militant radicals, either in the Black Power movement or the white radical movement, white Marxist movements of the time, they really lost favor. You had the election of Richard Nixon, you had a kind of then the rise of Ronald Reagan. These ideas lost favor, but they adjusted their strategy, and very self-consciously they called the new strategy the Long March Through the Institutions, which is an allusion to Chairman Mao Zedong when he was a military commander, winning the fight against the nationalists for the communists in China. And they had the idea that we cannot win democratically. We cannot win a kind of majority of electoral votes. So what we should do is try to insinuate ourselves within the public institutions, within the bureaucracies, and most critically within the universities and the K through 12 education system. This is documented in all of their writings. They were quite explicit about it. They have conference presentations in the 1970s about this strategy. And so what you see is then a shift. Actually, about half of the members, even of the Weather Underground domestic terror organization, managed to gain positions at universities, community colleges, and K through 12 schools. despite a history of violent subversion against the United States government. And while this is a very small group of people, the principle holds. You have this conscious movement to try to use the education system, first the universities, and then the K through 12 system, to reshape what is called critical consciousness through critical pedagogies, again, based on critical theory, in order to educate students into their own oppression, and then to encourage them to then engage in, essentially subversive thinking, hopefully leading to subversive actions. And when you take that basis of critical theory, what you see in critical race theory, which emerges really in the 1980s, is that a group of scholars, at that time predominantly minority scholars, but now I would say, as far as the institutional pressures, in some ways it's actually predominantly a faction of white institutional players that are pushing critical race theory. What they did is they took the basic framework of critical theory, dividing the world into oppressor and oppressed, using the mechanism of teaching and education as a method for political change rather than the search for truth. And then they injected what I think is what even Marcuse during the 1970s saw was the great soft spot in American society. Because of America's legitimate and truthful history of racial injustice, they believed that race could be a key pivot point. It could be a key foothold for change. And so what you see is that the critical race theorists at the beginning, if you look at their literature, they draw on the kind of a stew of different philosophies. Critical theory, which is a kind of neo-Marxist philosophy. They draw from critical pedagogy, which is the kind of teaching for revolution. They also draw from Antonio Gramsci, the great Italian thinker of the kind of early 20th century, who theorized about culture and Marxism. And they even admit in an interview, at the first conference of the critical race theorists, say, we were a bunch of Marxists actually meeting at a convent, I believe, in Wisconsin, if I have the location correct, where they really started and laid the foundation for critical race theory. And what you see now, and this is really, I think, a quick summary of the two, what I think are key principles operating within the ideology. You have one, race essentialism. For the critical race theorists, race is an almost essential category. You can be reduced to an essence of whiteness or blackness. These are things that you cannot change, you cannot overcome. And then they load all of these connotations on top of that. Whiteness, for example, is synonymous with oppression, racism, privilege, kind of property superiority, meritocracy, which they consider a flaw in our system. And then blackness, of course, on the other hand, is associated with many positive connotations. And there's that operates, race essentialism. The second, what you see also in many programs at higher education and K through 12 is this idea of principle of collective guilt, where if you share the same ancestry as someone who had committed a historical crime or injustice, you should inherently feel a sense of guilt, shame, or responsibility for that historical crime that occurred in many cases, in most cases, before you were born, by people who are not related to you, by people who may not share the same national origin as you, but merely share the same skin tone or pigmentation. And then finally, what I think is crucially important for the committee to understand is that when you ferret out the solutions within this literature of critical race theory, which in its kind of core text is only a few thousand pages of material, you find that they are, because it originated in law schools, they take a legal framework most of the time, but they really are deeply skeptical of the Constitution. They don't believe in the idea of an objective truth. And they believe that the Declaration and the Constitution were predicated on a lie to maintain white supremacy, to maintain capitalist exploitation, to maintain patriarchal and oppressive family relations. And so they set about in their academic work to demolish and degrade each of our core principles of the Constitution. For example, famously in a book collection called Words That Wound, they argue against First Amendment protections for any speech that may cause harm or discomfort or is racist or discriminatory in nature. They believe that that kind of speech should be eliminated, should be outlawed. So they want a severe restriction on the First Amendment. Also, the 14th Amendment, which guarantees equality under the law, is enshrined as a kind of colorblind institutional process. They want to eliminate that because in critical race theory, their idea is that individual rights are also inherently oppressive, favoring the status quo. They want to abandon the system of individual rights and equal protection under the law and replace it with a system of group identity-based rights. So race-based rights, sexual-based rights, orientation-based rights, and then use active racial discrimination, what they call positive discrimination, to balance the scales on a group basis, discriminating against members of higher income groups, for example, such as European Americans and Asian Americans, and using the power of government to discriminate against those groups in favor of others. And then I think the other thing that is really crucial, and according to the critical race theorists themselves was actually accidental, they've used their base within higher education, not only in academic departments, but also within these very powerful bureaucracies, often known as diversity, equity, and inclusion, or belonging, a whole kind of host of other euphemisms that are really serve as political litmus tests. According to professors that I've spoken with in my research, these departments enforce ideological orthodoxy. They punish professors with investigations, including Professor Boghossian, who you mentioned earlier, who's a friend of mine. And then they force faculty to submit regular, quote unquote, diversity statements to test their loyalty to the diversity ideology, to test their loyalty to the principles of critical race theory, and then to smoke out anyone who does not agree. And consequently, what you have at many universities, including many of our flagship public universities, certain departments have now about a quarter, roughly a quarter of faculty that self-identify in questionnaire and survey data as Marxist radicals. So that's about a quarter of faculty in the social sciences. And you have an imbalance that ranges from 30 to even as high as 60 to 1 at certain universities, where you have very far left professors outnumbering more conservative professors by a ratio of about 60 to 1 in some places. And this obviously creates the impossibility of open inquiry. The professorship does not reflect anywhere near the values of the public. And for public institutions that are funded by taxpayers, this is a major problem because you have these massive bureaucratic departments and then these professors who in about a quarter of cases in the social science identify as Marxist or radical, whereas the fraction in the population is much less than 1%. So you have a unrepresentative, ideologically driven kind of faculty that in many cases, if they adhere to critical race theory, reject the idea of truth. They believe that the university should be a base for political activism, for political subversion against the status quo, against the Constitution, against the system of capitalism. And what you see then as a final point is that critical race theory and critical pedagogy are now the most commonly assigned texts in graduate schools of education, including at our state universities. A book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed is now, according to some measurements, the most assigned text in graduate schools of education at public universities that certify and train teachers. And consequently, what do you have? You have a new cohort of predominantly millennial teachers that are entering the workforce in K-12 public schools. And they've brought this ideology of critical race theory from the graduate schools of education now into the classroom. And I'm happy to provide the committee with all of my reporting on specific examples. But in the next 1 minute before we take questions, I'd just like to highlight some of the specific stories that illustrate the consequences. You had a teacher who was trained at Columbia Teachers College, the most prestigious teachers college in the country, go back home to a public school in California, and then force third graders, children as young as 8 years old, to deconstruct their racial and sexual identities and then rank themselves according to their power and privilege. So you had a teacher forcing small children to separate themselves into oppressor and oppressed, and then atone essentially for their collective guilt for historical crimes. And luckily, parents fought back against this. They stopped it. But it was causing, I think, harm and borderline abuse to these kids. You also have, in some cases, teachers being trained by K through 12 schools. For example, in Springfield, Missouri, a place that you would not expect critical race theory, they were forcing teachers to identify themselves on an oppression matrix publicly. And white, straight, English-speaking, able-bodied Christian males were deemed the ultimate oppressors, and then were denounced publicly at training sessions in favor of other groups. They also said that anyone who is a Trump voter, for example, is a white supremacist, according to critical race theory. So politicizing and using the organs of the state funded by taxpayer dollars to achieve a political repression. And then finally, at a public high school in New York City, a principal emailed parents and said, white parents, you must become, quote, white traitors and then advocate for, quote, white abolition. This is straight out of the literature of critical race theory. The idea that the only way, this is all based on the work of a man named Noel Ignatieff, who believes that the only way to achieve equality or socialist revolution is to, quote, abolish the white race. This is an idea that is prominent not only in kind of graduate school seminars, which, you know, fine, discuss it, but is wholly inappropriate in a K through 12 public environment. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you for that information, Chris. I guess where I'd like to start here, could you give us a concise definition of critical race theory?
Yes. And you know, I'd be happy to send a link to, I've created a critical race theory briefing book for policymakers that has a definition, it has core concepts, it has key quotations, all of the journalistic reporting that I've done, and then some of the language that I think has been successful in describing it. Be happy to have my staff provide it. But for you listening now, I think that a great concise definition is critical race theory is an academic discipline that maintains that the United States was founded on white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalist exploitation, and that those forces are still at the root of our society. Critical race theory is deeply skeptical about the system of individual rights and constitutional government, and favors dividing society into oppressor and oppressed categories based on race, and then advocating for the overturning of some of the key social, economic, and governing institutions of our country.
So I appreciate the comments you had there. Some of those examples that you shared with us, I don't know if you're going to find anyone who would probably defend some of those things that were happening in the K-12 environment. When we look at the university system, being a proponent of free speech, being a proponent of the First Amendment, as I am, as I know the committee is, can you kind of walk through the difference here between, you know, having professors the academic freedom to discuss ideas? I mean, certainly there were crimes against history, and we ought to be able to talk about that. But how does CRT, in your view, sort of change from having a open, honest conversation about things that had happened into a more or less a movement that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, critical race theory isn't a historical discipline. It's not a discipline of historical scholarship. That's a kind of a ruse that many of them have been playing. But I think all of us, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who would want to restrict the discussion of historical events such as slavery, racism, Jim Crow, segregation, I know I got a lot of that in my K through 12 education and a lot of my college education, which I think is beneficial. The difference is that critical race theorists present their ideas not as one competing perspective among many, but as a truth, or as not even a truth, as a political necessity. And it takes this old idea of scholarship. Scholars kind of prior to the 1960s, really viewed themselves as dispassionate, detached, kind of skeptical of activism. They were trying to find a scholarly truth. Whereas now what you have is many professors inspired by critical race theory, critical pedagogy, are now treating the academic environment not as a protected space to search for truth, but as a protected space to push political activism. And taxpayers, and look, I support, for example, and I think you would all support, a professor's First Amendment right to express his or her own opinion. But the public is not entitled to subsidize that opinion with lifetime employment, with a cushy office and a salary, and a platform from a publicly financed and publicly chartered university system. So I think that while you have professors, I think they're, in some ways, restrictions on classroom speech should be avoided. You want to hire good professors. You want to give them the latitude to teach their classes. I think that the thing to look at is not necessarily, well, what ideas or principles or practices should we restrict? At the higher education system, I personally don't think that's appropriate or likely beneficial. I think it's looking at the structural nature of these questions, because do you really have free speech and free inquiry? If you have a 30-to-1 ratio of kind of liberal, radical, and Marxist professors compared to right-leaning professors, do you really have academic freedom and free academic inquiry if you have a diversity, equity, and inclusion department that is constantly policing the behaviors, attitudes, and speeches of right-of-center professors, right-of-center students, and subjecting them to loyalty oaths via diversity statements? What you have is such a lopsided system structurally that even that freedom of speech operates in principle but not in practice. It's almost a fiction because according to data from the Foundation of Individual Rights in Education and other groups, you now have what is a kind of silent repression of speech, a silent repression of different ideas, to the point where I would question whether substantively we have free speech on many university campuses at all.
Chris, I'm going to move now to other committee members. Senator Larson, did you have a question? Senator Nass?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Senator Larson, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I, apologize for not being there in person. I noticed nobody's wearing masks again. Thoughts and prayers to Andre Jacques. I would hope that we would start to adjust our practices so we're not spreading COVID. But despite that, I do have a question. I did some little background research on some of your writing, Mr. Ruffo, and it seems that there's an effort to try and conflate any effort to create racial justice or talk about racial oppression as just lumping it in with CRT, with critical race theory. So I'm just curious how far that goes, if it is, how far this goes with the scare tactic. If somebody says Black Lives Matter, are you conflating that and saying that's someone who's teaching critical race theory too, or is that not part of it? Or if somebody's talking about the 3/5 compromise in Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution, if somebody talks about that, is that part of what you would deem as critical race theory?
No, of course not. I don't think actually you could find anyone that would suggest that. Black Lives Matter is a political movement that the founders have themselves claimed derives in part from a kind of Marxist ideology. I don't think it's critical race theory. I think it's a kind of political movement, perhaps inspired by other left-wing ideologies. Talking about the Three-Fifths Compromise is basic history. That's been done for generations. I don't see any connection between the two.
Senator Larson, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I'm just trying to distinguish the line here. So I appreciate that that's not something that's being lumped in with it. You also said that there's a 30-to-1 ratio of Marxist and leftist professors. Where is that number from? It rings very similar to one of Wisconsin's former U.S. senators, where they were trying to identify intellectuals and professors and others as being part of being on a list, right? When Joe McCarthy was trying to out folks and silence folks. So I'm curious if there's a list that you're looking at where you came up with this of 30-to-1 ratio of Marxist professors in the universities across the country.
Great. Well, there's two separate statistics. I'm afraid you might be conflating two of the points. These are from academic studies. So, for example, there is a study not from Marxist and conservatives, but actually just liberal and conservative. It's a study in an academic journal by Mitchell Langbert and Anthony Quain, two professors. And they surveyed professors across the country, and they found, for example, the ratio of Democrats to Republicans, a stand-in for liberals and conservative, was 61 at Brown, 32-to-1 at Tufts, 14-to-1 at Berkeley, 16-to-1 at Yale, et cetera, et cetera. And overall in fields, they found that liberals outnumbered conservatives by roughly 33-to-1 in history, 20-to-1 in journalism, 17-to-1 in psychology, 8-to-1 in law. It's a long academic article. I'm happy to send it to you. And then for the question about self-identification as Marxists and radicals, this again comes from a book called Professors and Their Politics. It's an academic text. It's not a mass market book. And they surveyed professors, and they found that in the social science departments, 25% of professors identified as radical, 23% identified as activist, 18% identified as Marxist. Those are not mutually exclusive. So roughly a quarter identify as either radical, activist, or on the Marxist left. And this was, even higher in the humanities and holds true as a kind of nationally representative sample.
Senator Nass?
Yes. When you mentioned the professors and how many identify themselves as on the Marxist side and socialist, I guess bringing about at least a fairness and a balance so that you have, let's just simply say, conservative and liberal. I would imagine that is somewhat difficult unless we get at who the chancellors are, the system presidents, the board of regents, and so forth, similar to a school board, overseeing the institutions. So unless there is some other way to create that balance so that you would have the winnowing and sifting that should go on but does not go on in many cases, any suggestions on getting to reaching the objective of a balance?
Yeah, the question of achieving balance is very difficult. That's something that many people are trying to figure out. There's a professor and colleague of mine at Birkbeck College in London who is promoting the idea of creating some requirements, not only for, if you're going to create requirements for racial, gender, diversity, et cetera, viewpoint diversity. So actually forcing institutions to balance based on viewpoint. That's one approach. I think there are some problems to that. But the bigger problem is that what you have is a pipeline into academia that many kind of right of center leaning intellectuals segregate away from because they know that the kind of graduate education process and then the process of getting hired as a faculty position heavily weighs against them based on politics. For example, I've spoken with a number of professors in my research that are not yet tenured, who are kind of right of center, but would not dare to identify themselves publicly as such, would not dare to express their opinion publicly, would not even dare to express their opinion among their own faculty, departments, and colleagues. They live in complete secrecy about their own political beliefs, which I think is a extremely big challenge and correct. It has to be done, has to be addressed legislatively, has to be done through the regents or the chancellor's office. It's going to take a lot of thinking, but one thing you could do immediately is restrain the unbridled growth of DEI departments and then restrain their activities, because they're not, for example, teaching in the classroom. So there's really no academic freedom argument. You can actually restrain them quite easily through legislation.
Senator Nas.
I agree with you. I know several professors over time that have had to, quite frankly, keep their mouth shut until they get tenure. Otherwise, they would certainly be in trouble. Let me ask one other on a different route. We have legislation pending regarding transparency in the classroom K-12 so that parents can see the syllabi and the lesson plans. So if we were to take that to the university level, what would be your thoughts on that so that parents who are sending their adult kids to the various institutions that have a belief that they simply trust them, which is a mistake, that they would be, because their tax dollars are funding the institution, creating some kind of transparency so that whether it be a history class, an English class, the parents could actually, or the students actually, ahead of time, look at the syllabi and determine whether that's a class they actually want to take or it becomes indoctrination, what is going to transpire in that class and so forth. So creating some kind of transparency, a requirement that it be out there for the world to see, especially the taxpayers that are funding the institution. What would your thoughts be on that?
Yeah, I mean, in K through 12, I think it is an absolute necessity. At Manhattan Institute, we've created model legislation that you're free to view or adapt from, that has a transparency requirement created by my colleague Jim Copeland. I think transparency in K through 12 is a no-brainer. Every parent has a right to understand what's happening in their children's school, and I think at the public university level, I think it's also appropriate. Private universities, I don't. Private universities can operate with some privacy, obviously, in the very name private university. But a public university has a duty to the citizens that fund it, that make it possible. And I think that the image that I have in my mind is you have every taxi driver, housekeeper, and bartender in Wisconsin paying for this public university system. And they should have access to find out what they're paying for. That's a basic tenet of our democratic system. The public should know exactly where their money is going. The public should know which values are being transmitted by their institutions that they support. And I think that the requirement of publicly posting the syllabus is quite reasonable. And I think it creates an external public check on the university without coercion, without restriction, without impinging on academic freedom. It merely shows the public what's happening in the institutions that they support. I think anyone who opposes that is either trying to hide something, doesn't want the public to see, or is motivated by an ideology of secrecy that I think doesn't serve the public.
Senator Staffschulte. Senator Royce. Senator Fine. Senator Darling.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate your testimony. It was very concise. I have several questions. One is, how do you distinguish equity from equality?
Great question. So they're very different. This is a great linguistic trick, because what you'll see over and over, and I would suggest if you're thinking about language, to never adopt their language at face value. Equity is a perfect example. So the idea of equality that was first proposed in the Declaration, enshrined in the 14th Amendment after the Civil War, where it was consecrated in blood, codified into law in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, is the idea that every individual human being in our country should be held equal under the law, should be treated equally under the law, and that their individual rights should be protected. The right to property, the right to liberty, the right to conscience, the right to free speech, etc. Equity is a very different idea. Equity is the idea that we don't want to protect individual rights, that we don't recognize the validity of the progression of American kind of philosophy and jurisprudence over time, and that we want to shift to a regime of group identity-based rights. So you don't protect an individual's right to free speech, you protect a racial group's right to free speech. So if a word or phrase violates the kind of sense of safety of that group, you can then limit the First Amendment. And so you have very different competing categories. Again, equality is individual rights and equal protection under the law, and equity is group-based rights and public governmental discrimination on the basis of race, sex, gender, nationality, etc., in order to come to group equalities, so that all of the kind of all of the measurements of outcomes become equal. So that's the basic difference between the two.
I appreciate that follow-up.
Yes, Senator.
Do you have this on your link? Do you define the difference between equity and equality?
Yes, I do. I'm going to pull it up here. I'll drop it in the chat here so you guys can all get it. I have there, if you scroll down, there's a link to an article that I wrote in the Hillsdale Imprimis, Critical Race Theory, what it is, how to fight it. I have a more extended definition, recap some of the history that we shared today, and then have a definition of equity and equality.
Thank you. A follow-up would be, when we have started to talk a lot more about CRT, it's a big deal in my district, but as we talk to other legislators about it, they'll say, it's not in my district. It's not in my district. You know, our parents are involved and they know how to read it out. It is there. But I can give you two examples. In a prominent private school in my district, they have what they call a JEDI group. And JEDI stands for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And so parents say, oh, that sounds really good. Yeah, we need to work on limiting racism. It should be a part of our intellectual discussions with our kids. So how do you talked about linguistic tricks. So how do we get to this with the public so they can identify what is CRT? Because a lot of schools and a lot of people and a lot of policymakers can't see what it is as it's applied.
Yeah, I think a lot of those words, and again, I mean, all of us want justice and not equity, we want equality, inclusion, et cetera. Those are all very anodyne, very soft-sounding words, very favorable-sounding words. The trick, and what I would tell to you, but also to parents in your district, is when you see those words, it could be good. Some of the programs are okay. It could also be bad, but it should be a kind of red flag to inquire more. And what I would recommend is asking the school district, and then if they don't comply, filing a public records request or a FOIA request to find out exactly what the content is. Because oftentimes, the cover of a book can look good, and then inside the book is a different story. And I think that's really what's happening with a lot of these departments. And you have, under the rubric of diversity, equity, and inclusion, I've reported on stories where they're forcing children to denounce themselves for being racist oppressors, putting kids in tears, turning them against their families. I even reported on recently a mixed race family, black father, white mother, who said that after Black History Month, which they loved and they supported, had adopted principles of critical race theory, were teaching it to their kids. Their kids were terrified. Their kids were seeking to sleep in their bed again. And their kids were saying, should I hate my grandfather on the white side of the family? Is he bad? Is he going to hurt me? These are the kind of results that you see. You're not going to know it from the headline or the titles. You really have to do the digging, find out exactly what's happening. And in my experience, what really motivates people, what really awakens them, what really persuades them is very specific stories of exactly what's happening, because a parent might not know the lineage of critical race theory dating back to 1964 like you do now, but a parent will know if something is hurting their kids. And I think that's really what this boils down to.
Last question, if I may. So will you see any of this in curriculum? Because we're trying for transparency in the state, and we have several good bills related to that. But what does that actually look at when you post it? Is it going to be, is it in curriculum, or is it just the language you've talked about? Or how do we know it's there by posting by curriculum?
In my experience, you'll see it in the curriculum. It's something that you can't really hide, but I would insist on not just an outline of the curriculum where you could potentially hide it, but actually posting all of the curriculum and teaching materials that are being used. And then I would also include in this anything in the teacher training sphere. So individual schools or school districts training their teachers, a lot of this stuff comes up there because they're training their teachers how to do these pedagogies, how to practice this. So certainly in the classroom, there should be transparency, all of the teaching materials, all of the curriculum materials, but also anything related to race, gender, identity, diversity, inclusion, equity, anti-racism, et cetera, at the teacher training level. You're going to get a really good idea of what they're training teachers to do and what the ideology is of administrators.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. We will provide the document you put in the chat to committee members, as well as if you can, you mentioned a report or two that you were going to provide the committee. If you can provide that to my office, we'll make sure that that gets passed out to committee members. And we do appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Next, the committee will hear from Joe Cohn. Joe Cohn is the Legislative and Policy Director for the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, FIRE. He's a 2004 graduate of the University of Pennsylvania Law School and the Fels Institute of Government Administration. Joe joined FIRE in 2012, having demonstrated a career-long dedication to advancing the cause of civil liberties. He has served as a staff attorney at the AIDS Law Project of Pennsylvania, a staff attorney for the Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit, an adjunct professor of law at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and as the interim legal director for ACLU affiliates in Nevada and Utah. Now Joe leads FIRE's efforts to defend and advance the cause of students' rights through legislative advocacy. Joe, welcome here this morning.
Thank you so much for having me, Chairman Roth and members of the committee. As you know, as you may know, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, where I work, is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to defending the liberty, including free speech and due process rights of faculty and students at institutions of higher education across the country. We were founded in 1999 by a conservative professor and a progressive lawyer, with the notion that free speech only works if you truly are defending people on all parts of the political spectrum, because free speech is either guaranteed to everyone or it's guaranteed to no one. Over our over 2 decades of service in this area, we have fought for faculty and students' rights on every part of the political spectrum, from censorship coming from each and every part of the political spectrum as well, including plenty of examples here in Wisconsin, and plenty of examples dealing with this issue of critical race theory. One example, at Rutgers University, where the law school student government told student organizations that they couldn't get funding for their events unless their events approached their issues through the lens of critical race theory, we intervened and engaged in advocacy to point out how that kind of viewpoint discrimination just does not fly at public institutions. In Wisconsin, we filed an amicus brief defending the free speech rights of now late Marquette University professor John McAdams, who I actually met. I might even have been in this room a couple of years ago, because he was sanctioned for defending the rights of students in class to argue their conservative points of view. But we've also criticized and contested the points of view of some members of this committee over issues dealing with this issue when it came down to the teaching of a class called The Problem with Whiteness. And I bring all of these examples up to emphasize how important it is for FIRE to be both honest brokers of balls and strikes here, but also to emphasize that we don't have permanent friends or permanent adversaries. We view that someone can be right on one thing and wrong on the next, and then right again. And we have had constructive relationships and conversations with people whom we've had profound disagreements on. But our efforts to defend the rights of students in Wisconsin extend beyond those individual controversies. For years, we've testified in support of the campus free speech legislation that's still pending. I heard about that. And I think that was the context that I was here last. So I want to kind of turn the focus back to this discussion of how to think through these issues about critical race theory and emphasize that FIRE's expertise is in higher education. So the law is different in K through 12, where you're not dealing with the academic freedom concerns, where you're largely dealing with government's own speech in its curriculum. Although that's not to say that there are no constitutional issues you will have to navigate if you choose to go to the K through 12 side of this. But really, I want to focus my comments on higher education. To me, the debate is not over whether CRT is good or bad. That's irrelevant to the constitutional question of what actions you might do will pass constitutional muster and which actions you might do will not. So what I want us to kind of think through a bit are some of the ways we need to be careful in addressing this in higher education, where academic freedom has had such an important quintessential element to its success as an endeavor and has had such a central focus of the Supreme Court in its cases exploring the contours of those freedoms for over 60 years. You know, you have Sweezy versus New Hampshire, for example, establishing strong Supreme Court protections for academic freedom. And there are a lot of different, doctrines here that will come into play as we analyze how to deal with and what you can and can't do with respect to CRT in the sphere of higher education. So before I go into that, I do want to go a little bit into some of the Supreme Court case law, because I mentioned Sweezy versus New Hampshire, but I really want to read from one chunk of it, because I don't want there to be any question about how central this is here. And here in Sweezy versus New Hampshire, it's in 1957. The Supreme Court says, the essentiality of freedom in the community of American universities is almost self-evident. No one should underestimate the vital role in a democracy that is played by those who guide and train our youth. To impose any straitjacket upon the intellectual leaders in our colleges and universities would imperil the future of our nation. No field of education is so thoroughly comprehended by man that new discoveries cannot yet be made. Particularly is that true in the social sciences, where few, if any, principles are accepted as absolutes. Scholarship cannot flourish in an atmosphere of suspicion and distrust. teachers and students must always remain free to inquire, to study, to evaluate, to gain new maturity and understanding. Otherwise, our civilization will stagnate and die. Okay, and that's kind of the fundamental kind of first principle from the Supreme Court on academic freedom. And then a decade later, in Keishian versus Board of Regents, the court further enshrined the need to protect academia from governmental interference in particular, when it identified academic freedom as a special concern of the First Amendment, which does not tolerate laws that cast a pall of orthodoxy over the classroom. And the reason why I emphasize that so much is that some of the bills across the country and the current draft of SB 409 go into the classroom and take ideas off of the table in the higher education classrooms. So far, none of the states that have passed bills addressing CRT, of which there have been a handful, have done that. Not one. Okay? So they've done other things, but all of them, and some of them started out with similar clauses, but all of them had the wisdom to remove that before it went into law, because it would be blatantly unconstitutional in a slam dunky-ish of slam dunk kind of way. And the court kind of grounded its belief that the college classroom had to be protected because it's the quintessential marketplace of ideas. And a marketplace of ideas is going to have bad ideas in it. And it's going to have good ideas. And legislators sitting on a row of tables like yours in California or in New York would probably have a disagreement over which of the ideas are profoundly terrible to be in the classroom and which are great. And that's why we don't allow the legislators themselves to decide it, constitutionally. Then, after establishing this academic freedom, the court goes into broader free speech rights on campus in Healy versus James in 1972, where they considered a claim by students at a public university who had been denied official recognition by the university because of the student organization's views. And the court used that opportunity to say that state colleges and universities are not enclaves immune from the sweep of the First Amendment, and declared that the protection of free speech was no more vital than in the community of American schools. And the case goes on and on. And the reason why I'm being so firm on this is because it's absolutely critical that your bill cuts the provisions that go into what can and can't be said in the classroom. So while, you have the court does allow regulation in the employment context of some employees' speech, and indeed, public employers can generally regulate employees' speech that's regulated to the performance of their jobs. That's a case called Garcetti versus Ceballos. But even in that case, the dissent raised the concern that if that general rule is applied in the academic setting, there would be no academic freedom. The university could fire a professor for their controversial speech. And any of you who are concerned that there might be too few conservative voices in academia should ponder if that situation would be improved or made worse if it was normalized that government actors could root out professors because they make unpopular, uncomfortable arguments. I would submit to you that it wouldn't. And that's why I warn everyone to not fall in love with the club that will be used to beat you over the head. Don't start entrenching these systems that allow either legislators like yourselves or campus bureaucrats to decide what views are and are not acceptable writ large because of their comfort level, at least not in higher ed. Because I don't think that will play out very well for having unpopular professors. I don't think that Professor Bogdosian would have benefited if that was the norm. So with that backdrop and that general kind of framework, I I want to return to one last point on Garcetti, that the court itself thought about this academic freedom and said, we might have to carve out an exception for academic freedom, but that's not the case that's before us today, and we're not going to decide that issue until it's briefed. So consequently, across the country, there have been some circuits that have said it's a no-brainer, you need to provide an academic freedom exception to that rule that public employers can regulate speech that people are using in their performance of their jobs. And there are a lot of circuits that haven't addressed the issue at all, and you're in one of those circuits. But you can see how it would pose particularly grave threats if you don't have an academic freedom, exception there. So, with that kind of backdrop, I want to talk about some of the considerations about what you can do when dealing with CRT and what some of the other states have done that I think will pass constitutional muster, assuming the provisions are written carefully. The first thing is, and I know that Mr. Ruffo alluded to this, is that you don't have academic freedom concerns in place when you are regulating the positions that the institution itself is taking. Okay? And faculty members, when they're teaching, are not taking positions for institutions, because you have faculty members who disagree with each other all of the time, for example. But when the institution is doing its own trainings, whether it's to their own employees or to students, in orientations, and they're speaking from the institution's voice, that can be regulated without any academic freedom concerns. One of the issues we've had in some of the provisions that have passed in other states that have tried to tackle that problem is they've said, that the schools can't teach things on this particular list. It's a similar list to the one that you have in your legislation in their orientations and trainings. And some general counsels at institutions being, risk averse, interpreted the term trainings to also mean classroom regulation. So I would suggest and say that it would be an improvement on your legislation if you went that route to also have a sentence expressly stating that it doesn't apply in the classroom setting in higher ed. But that certainly can be done if you wanted to do that. Another thing that you can address is whether or not students can be compelled to agree with contested positions on this issue or any other issue. Compelled agreement does not pose academic freedom concerns because indeed the Supreme Court has talked about students' rights to have a freedom of conscience to feel differently and to disagree. That doesn't mean they can't be told and marked wrong on a test. 2 + 2, they can't argue why it should be 7. There are right and there are wrong answers, but students can't be required to affirm their belief of how they believe, how the professor thinks that race and sex dynamics play out in society. They can have a dissenting, point of view. So there have been provisions across the country that have been designed at prohibiting faculty from compelling agreement, requiring people to affirm, beliefs. And those provisions also need to be written carefully to make sure that you're not writing out of law a university faculty member's ability to require people to engage in devil's advocacy, for example, which is very common in law schools and a lot of other provisions. But in theory, you can have a provision, and I have model language that I think fairly, accommodates for the surrounding adjacent academic freedom concerns. But you can prevent compelled speech. But some other pitfalls that you should be concerned about that I want you to kind of think actively about is that we don't and haven't historically prohibited racism or sexism in this country. We prohibit discrimination. And we do it on a basis of protected classes to get at these concepts of racism, sexism, and other forms of discrimination, but we don't tend to resolve them up front with bans. Instead, our courts look at fact patterns and try to evaluate where they cross the line. And I am certain that I would agree with many of the examples that Mr. Ruffo could provide that I think do cross the line into violating already existing anti-discrimination law. And that's one of my other fundamental, points that I want you to consider, which is some of the worst examples, most of them, the ones that really are bad, like they get you when you read them and hear about them, they probably violate, Title VI, the federal anti-discrimination law dealing with racial discrimination, or Title IX in the Title IX context. And the value of pursuing cases under those statutes is that you have existing case law that balances out the concerns with the First Amendment. And what's interesting to me is a little bit of the juxtaposition here, which is that historically we have seen legislators from the Democratic Party, at least in the last generation or so, who have in many instances prioritized anti-discrimination over free speech. And some of the schools doing that as well, to go after conservative faculty members under the theory that their teachings violated, say, Title IX on gender, what have you. And it's been, at least in the last decade or so, on that particular issue of campus censorship, where it has been mostly voices from the right that have said, well, hold on, you have to have very tough standards before things actually do cross the line and being unprotected. And there are some serious First Amendment concerns here. But here we have the roles reversed. And what's fascinating to me is that in both instances, neither side was imagining that there are examples that do cross the line. But that when we don't have very high standards for when, speech loses its protection, we all will lose. We all will lose. We'll set the intellectual framework in other parts of the country to go after people whose views we all share. So, with that kind of observation, Connor Friedersdorf from The Atlantic wrote about that in greater detail in an article. I would say, avoid labeling things as racist or sexist or even divisive concepts in your legislation. If you want to tell the campus administration, don't teach these things in our orientations, you can do that. But once you start deciding that legislatively, as a matter of law, these arguments are racist, then you must ask yourself what other legislators in other states will decide is de facto racist, is de facto sexist, and how many of those things will cover the views that you hold. This very tension of the fact that people, believe differently about the extent to which racism is structural versus individual, I think is definitive about the fact that in our political spheres, there will be legislators who will decide the exact opposite when labeling what arguments are off of the table. So I would say that bans in advance are what we call generally prior restraints. And they're almost never as carefully tailored as you think they are. They almost always go, with as careful as you can, as much as thought that goes into it. They almost always will still hit a zone that you didn't anticipate that's slightly outside of it, which is why the case law is so disfavoring of prior restraints as opposed to having systems to respond afterwards when things go out of line. And the beauty of that is that, say, someone does blatantly violate Title VI, a complaint is sustained against the school that they violated Title VI by allowing it, then the school can take that authority as an employer and say, you have to knock that off. And if they don't, tenure or not, you don't have the right to violate people's constitutional rights. But upfront bans don't have that precision. So, I would strongly discourage you. I mean, they can't be done in the higher ed, setting in the classroom without rendering your legislation unconstitutional. But in the K-12 side, I would say, do give some serious thought about that same dynamic of of prior restraint versus are there other tools that don't have the same First Amendment, pitfalls as well. So that is my general pitch to you today. I guess what I would close with is that, generally speaking, I think that education is best when it starts debate and is usually at its worst when it settles debates. But we need to be precise in the tools that we use to address those instances, however common they are, when trying to address it, because once the Pandora's box is opened of labeling things and taking them off of the table, it will be impossible to restore until courts strike down all of the pieces of legislation that do that. So with that, I want to thank you for your time, and I'm really looking forward to answering the questions that you might have.
Thank you, Joe, for your testimony. And I should have said this as a point of your introduction here. This hearing isn't on any particular, for those who are watching or in attendance, it's not on any particular piece of legislation. Joe, I know you brought up Senate Bill 409, which is sitting before the legislature, not specifically what this hearing is on today. Through the course of the comments that you've made, it seems pretty clear to me that in, the idea of going after banning a certain type of instruction in the classroom in the university setting is probably not going to pass that constitutional muster. Did I hear you right when you said no other state, to your knowledge, has done that?
Yeah, in the final bills that passed that dealt with higher ed, you have a handful. You have Idaho, you have Iowa, you have Oklahoma, you have New Hampshire. I believe that is the list on the higher ed side. None of them have gone into the classroom and taken issues off of the table. They've done some combination. Oklahoma and I believe Idaho deal with the compelled speech aspect, and Iowa deals with the orientations and Oklahoma and Iowa deal with the trainings and orientations, and Idaho deals with the compelled speech, and there has been some amount of confusion about that concept of like what it is that counts as training. Does it hit the classroom? I think that most people don't think about, they don't say that I'm going to go to my training today. They talk about going to class. In this particular context, the word training, I think, is clear, specifically when you look at what was cut from the bill that did go explicitly in the classroom, that it wasn't designed to do so. But none of them have crossed the finish line with bans in the classroom in the higher ed side. And you should continue that trend if you pass legislation here.
So, recognizing that, can you elaborate then for us to what extent a university could go to require students to adopt viewpoints when it comes to enrollment or graduation requirements?
Yeah, I don't think that they can require, agreement with perspectives as a condition of graduation. I'm not as much of an expert on on what they can condition at the point of application, because there's a certain amount of screening that goes in, to try to make sure, like even in law school, you want to have diverse, classes that bring different perspectives and demographics to the table, in order to have, more vibrant, debate. Could they impose one particular viewpoint on everyone on the application process of public institution? I would say probably not. But few of the issues that I'm seeing here are really about that admissions stage at the moment. I mean, the freedom of conscience and the ability to have one's own opinion, the school can't really, once someone's matriculated, they can't infringe upon that in the classroom or as a graduation requirement.
We're going to go to the committee now. Senator Larson, did you have a question?
Not at this time, thanks.
Senator Nass?
How do you get at? It's good to have a balance, arguably, so you have that winnowing and sifting on both whatever views are out there. So how do you get at that if the dean is doing the hiring and the dean basically wants to just hire people who agree with him or her, and the chancellor doesn't step in to say, look, we got to have a balance, where it clearly in some cases is just tipped over.
Yeah.
How do you bring that about?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I have the silver bullet for you that solves all of those problems, because I agree that there's an imbalance right now. The Heterodox Academy is a nonprofit organization relatively new over the last few years that brings together faculty from both sides of the spectrum, specifically designed to promote that kind of heterodox view of diversity of debate. And I think a lot of the scholarship I've read in this area talks about how you don't need a 50-50 ratio to have, a healthy academic environment, but you do need to make sure that you support minority views. And I'm not talking about that necessarily from a demographic perspective, but I mean that from an intellectual perspective. And the way you do that is clearer, and that's by enshrining really robust academic freedom protections. That's going to, when I say that don't fall in love with the club that we used to beat you over the heads, because so many faculty on all parts of the political spectrum are targeted when they say something that's particularly egregious to whichever political party isn't in charge in their particular state. So, and it happens just so commonly. And it's not that I wouldn't necessarily agree that some of those views are really kind of over the top, but those are somewhat personal decisions and political calculations as well. So what I think you want to do is you want to make sure that that faculty can speak on matters of public concern, and that they can in class speak, on anything that is germane to their class while they're in class, broadly construed, because in the liberal arts, themes cut through literature, that span the gamut, for example. So you want to really be broad in the view of what is and is not germane. And then second, that when they do cross out of the territory of what's germane in the class, the other kind of prong that the AAUP has looked at for decades, and that I think is really wise, is if someone's going to step out of the lane, you don't want to, the second they do, that's it, and the school can get rid of you, because that's a recipe to have all kinds of pretexts to get rid of the people who say things that are unpopular. But if they repeatedly go well out of the realm of germaneness and use a tremendous amount of class time, at some point, if we're paying you to teach X, and you're using a substantial amount of time to instead get on your soapbox, the students aren't getting what they paid for either in their tuition. So that's kind of the test: germaneness and and some amount of substantial time. When you enshrine those particular protections for all faculty, tenured or not, adjuncts, graduate student instructors, then you set the conditions where faculty are emboldened. And when you stand up for them when they've stepped in it, and when I stepped in, I mean when they say something that really is egregious. If you find something really egregious from a faculty member, instead of calling for them to be chased out of town or to be fired, or that the university's budget will be cut if they stay on staff, instead say, this is why this is really bad, and I want to know what other teaching you have that's out there, what other programs are out there, so students are also getting the other perspectives. The more speech, remedy, that shows principled all the time, because you also have First Amendment rights to criticize, and you should. You should criticize people when you hear things that you find to be really bad. But it's when you cross the line to trying to weed people out, or get the bad points of view shut down. That's when we all lose. So that's what I think sets up the conditions to eventually get more diversity of thought.
I guess we have to primarily hope. I have a situation right now, UW-Whitewater, that is extremely out of bounds, where some of the faculty are offering extra credit to students if they'll go get vaccinated. It has nothing at all to do with the class. Yeah. Now, I have contacted the chancellor, and I'm hopeful he'll step in. I'm yet to know, but that's the egregious stuff that happens, where we got to rely on a chancellor, and if the chancellor doesn't want to do anything, there you are. So, thank you.
But shedding sunlight is sometimes helpful as well. I mean, it doesn't always have to have the hammer coming down to also just kind of make sure that these things are debated and discussed, because I think that is healthy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Staffschild, did you have a question? Senator Royce, did you have a question? Senator Fine, did you have a question?
You were mentioning about compelled speech and compelled agreement. I think we've all heard stories of students. I think Senator Nass and I were talking about this about a year ago, where you just go along to get along, so you don't want to rock the boat because you know you have opposite views of the professor, so you answer certain things in a certain way so he or she doesn't take retribution against you. How do you deal with those situations?
Yeah, I mean, it's a perfectly sane approach for a student in that scenario to choose to not stick their neck out. I mean, that's the self-censorship that we're also concerned about, and why FIRE does surveys at schools to kind of learn more about the attitudes of students and how comfortable people feel about speaking their minds on college campuses. I think you need to establish earlier on a free speech culture, and really go out of your way to explain how essential the freedom of speech has been to the success of every political evolution we've ever had, and the success of every civil rights movement, gender equality, you name it. I mean, the 19th Amendment wasn't earned because women politely talked about the need for the right to vote over tea. I mean, they marched, they stomped, some of them showed their ankles. I mean, it was outrageous stuff. But you do that by really making the case to everyone about how it has historically been to the benefit of everyone to hear that which makes us uncomfortable, that challenges us, and that to provide comfort to those who are targeted by more difficult speech in ways that don't result in censorship. So that I think is the other kind of long-term approach, is you need to establish a positive culture before there's a particular controversy, because there isn't a remedy for the student that doesn't test whether or not their faculty member is going to treat them well because they decide to censor themselves up front. There isn't a way to remedy that in real time. Thanks.
Senator Darling.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate your presentation. It's been very helpful, and you're obviously a great advocate for freedom of speech and have very specific ideas that we should consider in our legislation, so I thank you for that. My question is to revolve around freedom of speech. In your organization, you'd say that the students' right to free expression and freedom of conscience should be the first priority in the K-12 context, and public K-12 students should be afforded greater recognition of their First Amendment rights, and I think that's very important. In relationship to CRT, can't the concepts of CRT, can't they affect the rights, the freedom of speech of K-12 students? For instance, one of my friend's sons came home and said to his dad, did I do something wrong? Am I bad because I'm white and a boy? And he was very upset about that. So my question to you is, your goal to have freedom of speech, the CRT, when they put people into boxes, white, brown, and whatever, male, female, racist, not racist. How can we have model legislation that addresses that issue?
Yeah, I think that some of these examples do clearly violate students' rights in a number of different ways. Compelling agreement, actively engaging in discrimination when people are separated and actually segregated. There have been examples that I think are unlawful. As I said, in the K through 12 space. In fact, one of my colleagues published a book a week ago cataloging. I think it's maybe a little over a week now, cataloging example after example where students' rights in the K through 12 setting have been violated. So I don't disagree with you there. You don't have the academic freedom concerns because because K through 12, teachers are not there to express their personal views or research and seeking the truth. They're there to administer the state's curriculum. You do have to be concerned about potential vagueness because you can't punish a person, a teacher, or any other public employee unless there are clear, rules and guidelines. The only other thing I would say on that, because K-12 is not really my area of expertise, is you want to make sure that whatever you do leaves room for good, thoughtful debates about race and gender and other topics, and exposes students to a wide range of opinions that people have on these issues, including with some amount of, we all need to have some amount of humility to understand that our particular precise landing point on these issues isn't necessarily the right one, and to be willing to hear each other out, and knowing that the world as it is by being exposed to ideas isn't the same as being told that this is the right answer on these issues. So I would urge you to at least be mindful of that, to leave room to have debates about the possibility of systemic racism, to what extent it exists or doesn't exist. And the last thing is that thing I was talking about not labeling things as racist or sexist. That Pandora's box is identical issue K through 12 in higher ed, of you don't want to establish governments, bodies being the ones deciding what arguments violate law versus letting fact patterns, many of which will then still violate the law, but you don't need you doing the labeling. So that, I would say, is true on the K-12 side as well.
Could I just have one quick follow-up? I know you have
Yes,
a heavy
ma'am.
agenda. You mentioned discrimination and racism to a certain degree. Because this little boy's example, if CRT is putting kids in categories by race, by how they look, some critics contend that, and they feel that's really divisive. Can racism and discrimination be against the white as well as the other groups put into this mix?
Absolutely. I mean, the 14th Amendment is itself colorblind, even if it may be unwise to behave in a colorblind, fashion. By that I mean, as a matter of law in some ways. Like you could look at, say, I'm just giving an example. There's an honest debate about whether or not sentencing disparities with different drugs, even though there's no mention of the word race itself, is itself racist because of its impact. And there are those who would argue that if we can't recognize that because we just say that the bill itself is colorblind, then we're putting our head in the sand about the possibility of whether or not we are in fact perpetuating racism. So when I say, that the 14th Amendment is colorblind, I'm not saying that we should not evaluate whether or not policies can have disparate racial impacts, but that the 14th Amendment protects every kind of person based on their race and ethnicity from being singled out for those immutable characteristics and treated adversely.
Thank you.
Joe, the committee appreciates your time here with us this morning and the information that you had provided us. I think will go a long way as this committee grapples with this debate and some of the others that you mentioned, including free speech on campus and so forth. So
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Next, we're going to hear from Max Eden. Max is a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on education reform, specifically K-12 and early childhood education. Before joining AEI, he was a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. In addition to a number of reports and studies on education, Mr. Eden is the co-author of the best-selling book, Why Meadow Died, The People in Politics That Created the Parkland Shooter and the Endanger America's Students. He is also the co-editor with Frederick Hess of Every Student Succeeds Act, What It Means for Schools, Systems, and States. Mr. Eden has testified about school violence before Congress and about the school-to-prison pipeline before the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. He has a BA in history from Yale University. And with that, we want to welcome Mr. Eden. Welcome.
Yes, and thank you so much for having me. Before I begin remarks, kind of my obligatory notice that the American Enterprise Institute is a 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank. The opinions presented to you are not my institution's, but solely my own. I think I'd like to begin my remarks by extending off of a musing that I saw kind of through the transom by tablet journalist Wesley Yang, who said, put yourself in the eyes of somebody living in 1986. Ronald Reagan had just won 49 states. Top Gun was the most popular movie. Could you see 2021 from then? Could you see an era where a parent who said, I don't want my child to be shamed because of his race, would fear being labeled publicly a racist, when an individual who insisted on the basic distinction between men and women would be labeled a transphobe, or when a prominent university would remove a rock from campus for being a racist rock? And what Wesley Yang submitted is that one person, at least one person could, and her name was Angela Davis. Angela Davis is a name, a figure who was very, very popular in education circles, very popular in critical race theory circles in education. I have seen her name plastered across curriculum, across cultural competency plans in school districts like Chicago, with quotes to the effect of, in a racist society, it's not enough to be non-racist, we must be anti-racist. Angela Davis, of course, also was alleged to have bought a shotgun that was used in a kidnapping and murder of a US judge, for which he was put on the FBI's most wanted list, was an out-and-out communist, and was given the Lenin Peace Prize by the Soviet premier. So kind of the question is, how do we get to a point where a figure like that is held up as a key moral exemplar by officials, teachers, principals, superintendents, trainers of teachers who parents turn over their kids and entrust them with? I want to divide my remarks into three parts. One is to give a somewhat of a possibly extended, possibly slightly deeper intellectual history account of kind of where we are, why we're here. I'd like to focus a little bit more on what exactly CRT is, how it manifests in universities and in K-12 systems, and then also provide some discussion kind of pursuant to how the last testimony ended up regarding how this can be addressed both in a K-12 and a higher ed setting. So I'll start by going kind of chronologically and somewhat philosophically prior to where Mr. Ruffo started his testimony. He started his testimony with the critical theorists of the 1960s, the Frankfurt School, and their burgeoning influence within the American Academy more broadly. If you kind of go back to the source, the critical theorists considered themselves to be cultural Marxists, and the first appearance of the word critical or criticism in the way that it has been consistently used is, I think, quite revealing and should be brought to any thoughtful person's attention. It came from a letter that was written by Karl Marx to a colleague with the idea, the thought of how do we start an intellectual magazine? How do we start to move beyond an economic critique to becoming a cultural force? And he was very conscious that for all of his economic critiques, he had not yet established any sort of positive program for what society should look like under his preferred system. And he instead contended that he didn't really need to. He said, quote, "If constructing the future and settling everything for all times are not our affair, it is all the more clear what we have to accomplish at present. I am referring to the ruthless criticism of all that exists." The goal of this criticism would not necessarily be to directly affect policy making or the political system, but rather to reform, and this is also the first instance I've seen this word used in this way, something you've all heard many times, to reform consciousness. Quote, "The reform of consciousness consists only in making the world aware of its own consciousness and in awakening it out of its dream about itself, in explaining to it the meaning of its own actions." One other quote that's worth sharing, I'll tie them together. "It is a matter of confession and nothing more. In order to secure the remission of sins, mankind is only to declare them for what they actually are." And in these few selections in this one letter, I think you find in embryo the broader critical project, which is a project of criticizing what exists, not for the sake of understanding it better, not for the sake of assessing the moral merits or demerits of the subject that you're analyzing, but rather as a tool to reform the consciousness of an individual and to imbue a new spirituality, a new sense of sin into mankind. If that's somewhat kind of highbrow, high level, I'll take it down to a very concrete quote that I think speaks directly to it by Ibram X. Kendi, author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, kind of the most publicly identifiable and perhaps kind of publicly powerful critical race theorist or critical race adjacent public intellectual out there, who says the heartbeat of racism is denial and the heartbeat of anti-racism is confession. You must confess, or else you will not be able to remit your sins. You'll not be able to be a person in good standing. The reason I'm bringing these quotes up, and I have one more to offer before I shift gears, is that I think it's important for legislatures, for the population, for people to understand that critical race theory is not merely a theory. It's not merely a set of practices. It is really an attempt at founding a new civil religion, and quite a religious one at that, albeit not a religion that is explicitly consistent in Judeo-Christian ethos and Christian doctrines, but one that is a self-conscious kind of heretical derivation of them in a couple of negative ways. This argument was made very compellingly by Joshua Mitchell, a professor at the University of Georgetown, who argued that taking similar priors and intuitions of Christianity, critical race theory separates the world into innocents and transgressors, and claims that the world can only be purified through the scapegoating of the transgressor, who is an individual who, per Ruffo's remarks, is identifiable as part of the oppressor class. And what haunts me about, I think, the philosophical, ideological, pseudo-religious tendency of critical race theory was captured very well in this one paragraph of Mitchell's that I would like to read verbatim. He refers to this whole phenomenon as identity politics. We can kind of discuss terminology a little bit more later, perhaps. He says, "In the world that identity politics constructs, however, fathers and mothers can never be right, and sons and daughters can never be wrong. The collateral damage caused by this default posture is immense, not least to those sons and daughters whose anxieties seldom disappear and are often amplified after they leave convention behind. Because identity politics informs them that only those who consider themselves among the innocents count, sons and daughters are understandably eager to embrace identities that they believe will relieve them from the unredeemable burden of transgression that they would otherwise carry. The moment they take the shortcut that turns out to bring no rest, fathers and mothers must renounce their authority over them altogether and hand their sons and daughters over to therapists or doctors whose livelihood depends on the staggering transfer of authority. A surer path to the premature and permanent extraction of sons and daughters from their families, compelled by state-sanctioned experts, has yet to be devised," close quote. So I kind of wanted to begin by offering that philosophical pseudo-religious argument as further framing for what is at stake in all of this. When one can hear of absurd and ridiculous lessons that seem offensive, seem wrong, seem unconstitutional, one can hear of arguments that seem un-American, anti-patriotic, and one can be kind of properly and discreetly troubled by all of those things. But there is a larger tendency at work here that I think, also to piggyback off of Mr. Ruffo's remarks, is something that parents are starting to realize is no longer confined to the university. There's kind of long been a sense of, well, I'm sending my kid off to college and he might come back thinking that everything that I stand for is bogus. I feel as though, and fear as though, from conversations I've had with parents and some teachers, that same sense is starting to permeate down to the point where people are sending their kids off to school on a school bus and having that similar fear. And there is a reason why they have that fear. In the university context, I think there are a few things that can and should be said about the way that this cultural force plays out that is against kind of the spirit of the university, and the reason why universities exist, the reason why taxpayers pay for them, the reason why you all as legislators kind of oversee and subsidize them. One is obviously for the advancement of the intellect, for the elevation of the intellect. And I think it should not go without saying, although it's frequently perhaps rude to point out, much of this is in practice profoundly stupid and stupidifying. If you take a look at somebody like Ibram X. Kendi, who is held up to be a public intellectual par excellence, and you ask him what racism is, which his whole career is on the definition of racism and how to oppose it, he will say, racism is the collection of racist ideas and racist policies that have racist outcomes. He will then go further on to say that any policy that has a disparate impact is a racist policy. These are things that A, short circuit thoughts, and B, prevent discussion, right? Because in modern American parlance, racist is not simply is a fundamental and almost theological moral category that if we train our students at the K-12 level, the college level, to be quick to apply that to any idea that they find uncomfortable, any state of affairs that they might not like, we are doing a profound disservice to their intellect. We are reducing their ability to be a functional and thoughtful citizen. And this is something that is kind of by design. You had asked Mr. Ruffo to kind of give his definition of critical race theory. I would say I disagree. I agree with most, if not all, of what Mr. Ruffo writes and argues. Any plausible disagreements he and I can hash out amongst ourselves at some other time. But I'd like to offer you not Mr. Ruffo's definition, but a definition by a man named Richard Delgado, who is widely credited as one of the key architects of critical race theory, from a book called Critical Race Theory: An Introduction. And this is a couple paragraph quote. I swear the last extended quote that I will read to you verbatim. Quote, "The critical race theory movement is a collection of activists and scholars interested in studying and transforming the relationship among race, racism, and power. The movement considers many of the same issues that conventional civil rights and ethnic studies discourses take up, but places them in a broader perspective that includes economics, history, context, group and self-interest, and even feelings and the unconscious. Unlike traditional civil rights discourse, which embraces incrementalism and step-by-step progress, critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law. Although CRT began as a movement in the law, it has rapidly spread beyond that discipline. Today, many in the field of education consider themselves critical race theorists who use CRT's ideas to understand issues of school discipline and hierarchy, tracking controversies over curriculum and history, and IQ and achievement testing. Political scientists ponder voting strategies coined by critical race theorists. Ethnic studies courses often include a unit on critical race theory, and American studies departments teach material on critical race theory developed by CRT scholars. Unlike some academic disciplines, critical race theory contains an activist dimension. It not only tries to understand our social situation, but to change it." Close quote. I offer that to you in part because one thing that I have seen play out frequently, I think in bad faith, is a certain game of linguistic gotcha of people who will say, that's not critical race theory, that's not critical race theory, oh, you might not like that, that's not critical race theory. Critical race theory is just a legal academic discipline purely protected by academic freedom, and anything that you don't like, you can't just label it critical race theory and present this unified boogeyman that you oppose. But it's worth pointing out that critical race theory defines itself as more than just an academic discipline, as an activist strategy, as an activist disposition, and as one that, by its own admission, opposes the key components of the American political order: rationalism, constitutional law, legal equality. It is self-consciously opposed to that. And as Chris Ruffo mentioned, it has found the most compelling way it can to advance that subversive case through the lens of race, through arguments about racial essentialism, collective racial guilt. There are a few points of perhaps somewhat philosophical, I would not go so far as to say legal because I'm not a lawyer by training, disagreement between myself and the last scholar. One is that I would argue that what you brought up Senate Bill 409, which I had reviewed before this, which the hearing isn't about, but I'll speak to it briefly. To my somewhat lay analysis, that isn't a bill that directly takes aim against a theory or a teaching of a theory. It is rather a bill that, at least in the K-12 context, and we can delineate between higher ed classroom and higher ed broader campus community at a later time, basically seeks to expand the practical protections already offered by Title VI of the Civil Rights Act when it comes to racial discrimination. And in order to explain what I mean by that, I like to provide a kind of a counterfactual argument and ask folks to kind of reflect on it, right? What if in the wake of the Black Lives Matter riots of the summer of 2020, the string of murders attached to them, the property damage done by them, teachers, either college administrators, high school teachers, perhaps professors, were casting about to try to explain why that was and to tell their students why that was. And they landed on the root cause of that phenomenon being Black savagery. And they decided that it's the important mission of their institution to disrupt and dismantle Blackness and to make sure that every Black student understands that even if they don't feel savage, they inherently are savage and as such must be transformed, right? Even articulating this as a counterfactual is so beyond the pale. I almost feel a sense of shame in even saying it, but I bring it forward because that is illegal under the Civil Rights Act. There's no way that would pass muster. There is no way that would be allowed to occur by the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, the body that is primarily, although not exclusively, responsible for enforcing the Title VI protections of the Civil Rights Act. Unfortunately, it is all but the stated opinion of the Biden administration that those protections don't necessarily apply to white students or white teachers, to call a spade a spade. In Evanston, Illinois, there was a school district that taught that whiteness was a contract with the devil, that separated students by race, that forced teachers to declare their white fragility. And there had been a ruling by the last administration's Office of Civil Rights that this violates civil rights. This is against the law. You can't separate students by race. You can't shame students based on race. And the Biden administration decided to rescind that ruling, to let it slide. So I would frame to you in part that what you are faced with, the task that you are faced with, is in part the question of how do you expand the protections of civil rights to students of all races. As the last gentleman mentioned, theoretically, it is all the law of the land. It should already be applied, but it will not be applied, at least during this administration, I would go so far to say, by the traditional body that enforces it. And that leaves a question to state legislators as to what can you do about it? I now want to shift to discussing some possible solutions, ideas, both at the K-12 and at the higher education level. At the K-12 level, I will have a paper coming out soon, which I'll try to send you guys once it's all out, that looks at all of the proposed and past quote unquote civil critical race theory bans that have been introduced or debated to date, and kind of divides them into three typologies. There are the bills that prohibit compulsion, which the last speaker spoke about, which would basically say you cannot force a student to say that because I am white, I am therefore less good or I am therefore privileged. But under those prohibitions, you could still tell students that. You just couldn't force them to repeat after yourself or grade them on it for a test. There are also prohibitions against inclusion, which is the bucket that 409 falls into, to my understanding, which says that you shall not make these ideas and concepts part of the curriculum. This starts to run up against some plausible issues of censorship, free speech, quote unquote, at least in a small c constitutional sense at the K-12 level. In a broader sense, teachers are hired speech. They speak for and on behalf of the public who is paying them and the elected officials who oversee them. And you are allowed to compel them to say certain things and prohibit them from saying other things. But there's still a certain reticence for folks to outright ban the teaching of certain materials, or to say that these ideas may not present themselves in any form. The form that I like the best is at this point a draft legislation that's been introduced in the North Carolina State House. It's also been introduced in Congress by Tom Cotton, which prohibits promotion and has a kind of a three-part definition of promotion, partly prohibiting compulsion, so it contains that category, partly prohibiting contracting with any third-party vendor that promulgates these ideas, which is, to my mind, a slam dunk no-brainer that's frankly missing from some other bills. And then most importantly, prohibiting the presentation of these ideas in a way that could reasonably give rise to the appearance of endorsement. And I think that this bypasses part of the concern, certainly at the K-12 level and also at the college institutional level, if not at the college classroom level, the free speech concerns, because it is not to say that these ideas may not be presented to students in any form. It is rather to say that they may not be presented to students as true. And the locus of the dispute is not, has my kid been presented with an excerpt from Ibram X. Kendi, from Robin DiAngelo, from Angela Davis? It is my teacher basically telling my kid that Angela Davis is the gospel truth? That is an entirely appropriate line for a state legislature to draw in K-12, and it's also an entirely appropriate line for a state legislature to draw in higher ed in an institutional sense. When it comes to the higher ed classroom, I'll broadly defer to the last speaker. I am not well versed in the constitutional controversies and decisions regarding the speech of professors, and so I have nothing to add or dispute to what he said in that regard. But I would say that there are many other ways that this broader issue can be addressed that I do not believe fall into any constitutional, quote unquote, civil rights conflicts, that is entirely within the realm of the legislature, and that also could stand a reasonable chance at beginning to shift the culture of the institution, because this is not simply a curricular question, it is a cultural question. One point that I somewhat intended to make before, is that while state universities were by and large founded as explicitly secular institutions, many private universities in America, certainly the founding ones, were started as seminaries. They were started as seminaries for various sects, for Baptists, for Protestants, for Catholics, and many of them are effectively still seminaries. They're just seminaries with a different moral theological teaching. And a question to legislatures is, what do we want the broader moral teaching of the universities that we are elected to oversee, that we take money from citizens to fund, and then that we tell citizens, here is where you can send your child partially at the state's expense? I'll submit there are several very actionable items that, to my mind, to my review, have not yet, for the most part, not yet been attempted. Should be, and I think will be, and it would be great to see some states start to take up the banner. One, which was alluded to by Mr. Ruffo, and I think perhaps by the last speaker as well, is diversity, equity, and inclusion statements as a condition of hiring. The American Enterprise Institute will have a paper coming out on this soon. In many, I won't give the number yet, but in a shockingly large number of applicants for faculty positions are asked a question like, what does diversity, equity, inclusion mean to you? What does anti-racism mean to you? What have you done in your career to advance the principles of DEI or anti-racism? These amount to effectively loyalty oaths to a counter-constitutional ideology as a precondition for employment in higher education. That should not happen. That is within the purview of the legislature to simply say, that should not happen, because we value free inquiry, because we value a diverse opinion set, because we do not want our institution to become an intellectual monoculture. We will not allow you to precondition faculty employment on an ideological litmus test. Another way that the cultural enforcement of kind of CRT broadly defined takes place on professors is through student evaluations. I'm not familiar with the University of Wisconsin's explicit policies on this, but I've heard from many professors who say that the university has decided that their quality as a professor, their job performance will be evaluated partly by student responses to asking students, does this teacher value equity? Does this teacher value DEI? Does this teacher value anti-racism? And so that becomes a cultural enforcement mechanism given to students to police the speech of their professors towards a distinctive ideological end. There is also, as Mr. Ruffo alluded to, the phenomenon of the diversity and equity and inclusion bureaucracy, the DEI staff. There was a report out of the Heritage Foundation the other week, which looked at DEI staff in various state universities. And to my recollection, Wisconsin, I think, ranked 18th out of 65 in terms of the most DEI faculty on their campus. These officials, there is no research that suggests that these officials contribute to a better campus culture, to a more congenial campus culture, and there's every reason to believe that they act as effectively ideological commissars to enforce a certain moral vision upon the rest of the universities. There is no reason that these jobs need to exist. This money can be put to other places. We have seen cases in other states. I've heard of a case from University of Tennessee, Knoxville, I believe, where they basically defunded the DEI positions at that university and took that money and devoted it to low-income minority scholarships. That's actual valuing diversity, equity, and inclusion in the way that I think that we would prefer to define it. Of course, within a couple of years, as I've heard, the University of Tennessee put all those job positions back with slightly different names. But there is an active bureaucratic kind of parasitic force that has grown in public universities that serves no good or productive or frankly justifiable purpose, whose purse strings you can, if not cut, at least reallocate in a way that actually advances the priorities that you think that your fellow citizens share. There's also a broader academic question that can be asked, which is, you as a legislature are either cannot or frankly should not go in and address individual professors, try to get individual professors fired. Any effort to that extent would be frowned upon. You'd probably lose in court, but you should at least ask, is there value to certain things that are being taught? And do we want to fund certain avenues of inquiry, certain departments? You wouldn't necessarily prohibit them from being conducted, but do you want to fund a department of sociology that produces, if and when you see all the curriculum, resources, CVs, the scholars, nothing that you believe that you or the taxpayers see a value? One suggestion I would put to you in this regard is to ask chancellors, to ask the deans of every respective department to submit a report explaining how academics in their field and in their field broadly, in the department particularly, can see their work falsified, right? Falsification is the fundamental process by which the advancement of knowledge continues. To articulate what falsification looks like is very easy in mathematics and physics and the social sciences, and to some extent can be in some branches of the humanities. But in gender studies, in some ethnic studies departments, in some sociology departments, what's going on is not the advancement of research, the advancement of information through exploring and attempting to falsify or fail to falsify hypotheses. It is essentially idea laundry, just taking ideology and inserting it into academic journals to give it the appearance or patina of being genuine rigor, rigorous instruction, rigorous thought, and it kind of a whole lot flows from that. I think state legislatures should at the very least ask to review how the people who lead certain academic departments see their work in terms of facilitating and participating in the broader exercise of intellectual progress. One final thing to point out to bridge higher ed to K-12 is teacher certification. My understanding is that the state of Wisconsin requires degrees from institutions of higher education to teach in K-12 schools. There's very little evidence that teachers' colleges provide any value add to instruction or outcomes, and there's plenty of evidence that they are places of kind of intellectual indoctrination. One of my colleagues at the American Enterprise Institute published a paper which could not unjustly be paraphrased as arguing that about half of all people who worked in the schools of education that they studied, which was, I believe, like the top 50 most prestigious, focused on a race-related, arguably critical race theory-oriented position. At the very least, the legislature should ask itself, do we see any economic value to this requirement given the lack of outcomes associated with it? But also a question to be asked is, do we want to maintain a system where we effectively put as a precondition to teaching K-12 students that teachers be marinated for a year or two in this ideology? In terms of K-12, I'll give a couple other thoughts. I mean, one is that you would ask Mr. Ruffo about the academic transparency piece. That's something that we have kind of published through the American Enterprise Institute as a report, inspired by the folks at the Goldwater Institute. I've chatted with some of my counterparts at the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. It's an idea that I think is excellent. It's very hard to argue against. Ultimately, the power of any state legislature will be limited to affect what actually goes on in the classroom. You can try to set a new moral message. You can try to set certain guidelines about things that you perceive, that you believe should be viewed as illegal discrimination or, beyond the pale doctrines to present to children as true. But ultimately, it's the parents who will have to do that policing. The parents will have to be looking at the curriculum to see, as Mr. Ruffo said, is this DEI stuff in our school fine or is it malignant? Is this curriculum that teaches about the role of slavery in American history factual and reasonable and indicting enough to a degree, or is it fully stilted, doesn't present any traditional arguments that have been put forward on these things? Those are conversations that need to occur at the local level, and anything that you do as a state legislature to facilitate that is a step in an excellent direction. I'll leave you with one final thought on that, which is that my recollection is that Wisconsin holds school board elections off cycle, that they do not hold them on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in the November of an even year. This dramatically reduces voter turnout and allows for teachers' unions to really punch above their weight when it comes to electing school board members. I think that there is kind of a question in a lot of parents' minds of, wait, if so few of us want our kids to be taught this stuff, at the Manhattan Institute, Chris's outfit published a paper looking exclusively at urban districts, which were all in all, by their calculation, 2-to-1 Democrat to Republican. 2/3 of parents wanted critical race theory removed from their school. Not just that they didn't like it, but they didn't want it to be taught in any way. How is it that we have gotten to a point where the will of parents and what parents want for their children is so fundamentally at odds with what can be presented to them? And I would posit to you that a big part of that is a breakdown of democracy at the lowest and the most local level that has been facilitated by moving school board elections on cycle and effectively insulating them from the ability of parents to see something, say something, organize, and try to elect school board members that actually represent them. So that is it for my intro remarks, and I would be more than happy to take any questions.
Max, I appreciate your time with us here today and your testimony. I don't know if this is you had mentioned one of your colleagues, but I had been reading Robert Pondischio. He had said that university schools of education have long seen themselves as instrument for remaking society along lines more congenial to social justice activists. Your expertise seems to be more in the K-12 arena. Is there a benefit, when we're educating our teachers in higher education to go into our K-12 schools and educate our students? Is there a benefit to any kind of to kind of getting away from just the reading, writing, and arithmetic, or in your view would focusing on those things be the most acceptable use of their time and training?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I mean, I think it's my colleague Robert Pondischio has pointed out that has also pointed out that it should really be kind of staggering and stunning that so many teachers seem to view their role not simply to kind of impart knowledge and to act in loco parentis with a full respect of what it means to act on behalf of parents, but as agents of social change themselves, as effectively de facto political activists. And they are taught to want to teach that way, to think of themselves that way. And I think you're referring to an excellent article written by my colleague in Commentary, where he goes over, to some degree, the way in which the academic professoriate sees itself as an engine of social change that can, I think, be broadly categorized under the intellectual umbrella that I described earlier. That is not only harmful in itself, in my personal professional opinion, and harmful to the body politic, and it's not only useless according to the literature that's examined the role of teacher certification, master's degrees in education on outcomes. The only thing that really seems to make a difference for how students learn is a subject area master's degree, right? So a math teacher who has a master's in math will teach better than a math teacher who doesn't, but a math teacher who has a master's in education will not teach better than a math teacher who doesn't. But the harm done by this emphasis is more than just kind of a political, ideological, more than just a waste of taxpayer money. It also comes at a very real, what's the counterfactual cost, right? Because when you will hear very frequently, probably in testimony and conversations, the evidence says this, we know this, the data says this, the science says that. I've been to some degree, to I think a lesser degree than many, guilty of this at times myself. But one of the few things that we really do know with a reasonable degree of certainty is how to teach early grade literacy. And it is, suffice to say, not only not what teachers are taught to teach in most schools of higher education, but also what teachers are taught to effectively disregard and to not give any credence to in schools of higher education. And so to a large degree, I think it's not unreasonable to posit the broader literacy crisis. The fact that so many kids can't effectively read by third grade is due not necessarily to a failure of the school district as such, but to a failure of teacher training, when teachers are put through institutions that kind of not only refuse to pick up what we kind of know works, but actually aggressively disregard it.
In your research, when did this transformation take place? Did it with teachers taking on more of that social justice or activist role? Did it follow the timeline that Chris Ruffo set out, or did you find something different?
I think that the way that my colleague Robert Bendisio put it in his commentary piece was very apt as well. He used that kind of famous Hemingway line from The Sun Also Rises, where the character is asked, "How did you go broke?" And the answer is, 2 ways: gradually and then suddenly. And Robert applies this to the question you're asking, how did public education, schools, higher education go woke? 2 ways: gradually and then suddenly. Everything that Mr. Ruffo identified is reasonably true, is consistent with what Robert pointed out in his commentary article. If you go back through kind of the annals of the American Educational Research Association's annual conference, you can just see a strong emphasis on what, to my mind and my money, and I think probably to many Americans' minds and monies, is nothing more than ideology mill / ideology mongering as being one of the main things that occurs in schools of higher education. What really changed, I think, was that there was a switch that flipped kind of in American society, but also kind of in activist quarters in general, post George Floyd, that changed the moral ecosystem that teachers and staff operated under, right? I mean, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, you would have teachers who would have been exposed to these ideas in their teacher training and who might kind of passively believe them, but would not necessarily forthrightly put it in front of their students in a way that a parent might be worried is indoctrination, because they were worried that the parent would complain to the principal would call them in, it'd be very unpleasant. And so there was a certain kind of basic social check held in place. That switch flipped when you started to see major educational organizations in the summer of last year, the American Association of School Administrators, the Council of Chief State Officers. Obviously, the unions have been more kind of on this train and pushing it harder than others, but almost every major public education establishment organization became very explicitly for these things. The social and cultural, social media landscape switch to the point where you started hearing concerns or cases where the teacher or principal would be fired for saying all lives matter on social media. So what really has happened is both the gradually and the suddenly. And as legislators, as policymakers, there's a question of how would you fight back against each of these things, or how would you kind of restore a more desirable state of affairs? And I think there has to be, therefore, two tracks to it. One track is, how do we kind of reset the default moral clock of school leaders to the point where, instructing kids to think about their white privilege would be as morally unthinkable as instructing Black kids to think about some undesirable quality that they have. I think that a state law of the sort that you were contemplating and the precise provision and wording of it is something that should be, subject to further refinement and consideration. But a law is an excellent way to send a basic moral message and to start to reset that kind of internal moral compass that these school districts govern themselves by. And the second question, of the longer term question, is a longer term project, but I think part of the reason I gave like a laundry list of 6 ideas, very few of which have been tried, was to gesture towards how I think state policymakers could begin to chip away at the gradually part.
Thank you. Senator Larson, did you have a question? Senator Nass, did you have a question?
I will watch for your paper regarding K-12 and higher education. It's unfortunate that the amount of time spent on critical race theory is not diverted to reading and writing and mathematics and things that will really affect the survival of students beyond graduation. And we know that we are here in Wisconsin and elsewhere deficient in those areas. And I'll just simply mention it triggered in my memory the loyalty oath, so to speak. What have you done? That is occurring right now in our other departments outside of education, but here in the state of Wisconsin in various agencies, and it's clearly concerning and something that the legislature should certainly focus on. Thank you.
Senator Staffschulte. Senator Royes. Senator Fine. Senator Darling.
Yes, I appreciate your emphasis on K-12 and your specific ideas that we need to dig into. You mentioned the movement from educators being agents of social change versus agents to teach and make sure the students are learning what they need to do and know before they leave and go on to have a chance for a successful life. Is there any state in our country who really has made that shift from agent of social change to making sure that the students are actually addressing standards of learning and doing?
So kind of, and I'll use this to segue to another kind of policy idea recommendation. Also, I should say I would happy to make myself available to any of you individually after the fact if there's any idea that kind of struck you and you want to chat about further. I'd be very happy to. The state of Florida passed a regulation out of their Board of Education, not through effective legislation, that basically, in some ways, it may or may not go further than some would, that all but prohibited teachers from presenting like their personal opinions on matters of public debate, and also contain the provision that I think should be essential everywhere, that any presentation of any issue that is contemporary, live, controversial, that both sides be presented, that no one side of any contemporary debate ever be exclusively represented. I'll use that to bridge to another idea that my colleague Robert Pendicio, who I mentioned before in response to the last gentleman's question, has been kicking around an idea that I think has a lot of merit on, although we have not kind of developed the text of it, it's still a work in progress, of a teacher code of ethics, of a kind of list of things that teachers can be asked by their school board, school district to agree to as part of their job, to articulate to them the role of a teacher as somebody whom parents trust with their kids for the sake of building academic skills, not as an activist or political agent. And one thing that could be done, there are kind of two ways that this could be put out. It could either be passed to some degree by the state legislature, or it could be a model teacher bill could be introduced in legislation, in state legislation, that requires school districts to vote on it. Right? I mean, there is this certain kind of, when it comes to conservative leaning policymakers, there's a certain kind of a reticence or split-mindedness between, well, this belongs to the states, but it's also the communities, and to what extent do we really want to have state mandates or, have the legislature controlling what goes on in local school districts. One way to, I think, very productively split the baby, which I guess is a bad metaphor because I think it's a good idea, is to put forward things that you as a legislature firmly believe should be on the literal agenda of school boards, that school boards should have to decide yes or no on, and then that after the fact, parents can see how the school boards vote and can then act accordingly. Because there may be some districts where they would hate that, and they really do want their teachers to help train kids to become, climate activists or anti-racists or whatever. But that question should be directly put to locally elected officials who should then be held accountable to them, who should then be held accountable to the people who elect them. Of course, there's still the problem of off-cycle elections that severs that connection. But I think what Robert has argued, and one can find, I think, his pieces on this, at least argumentative pieces on this pretty easily through Google, is that school districts should all adopt a teacher code of ethics. He views it as an alternative to critical race theory bans. I view it as complementary. The American Enterprise Institute, we don't always, we value diversity of opinion, and our scholars don't always directly agree with each other. But I want to put that on your radar as well.
Thank you.
Max, we thank you for your testimony here today, and for the materials I believe that you're going to be providing our committee as well. With that, the committee is now going to move on to the University of Wisconsin. We have 3 individuals who are going to come before us, and I will let them to come forward here at this time. I don't have as robust of introductions for the 3 of you. Let me give you what I have, and then in your remarks you can certainly expound upon your biographies. We have joining us here today Dr. Frank King Jr., the Executive Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Associate Professor of Ethics Studies at UW-Platteville. We have Dr. Javier Tapia, an Associate Professor of Educational Policy and Community Studies at UW-Milwaukee. And we have Dr. John Zumbrunen, the Vice Provost for Teaching and Learning and Professor in Political Science at UW-Madison. And as I mentioned, I think we'll start with Dr. King, and then we will just go from Dr. King to Dr. Tapia and then Dr. Zumbrunen. Feel free to expound just a little bit on your bios if you'd like to add anything to that. You have certainly been here. I've seen you here for the whole totality so far of this discussion, so I will let you begin your remarks and we'll go from there. So, Dr. King.
Chairman Ross and members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to testify today concerning the topic of critical race theory, or CRT. My name is Dr. Frank King. I've been a professor in ethnic studies at UW-Platteville since 2014. I am currently working as an executive director in the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. The current discussions of critical race theory is a result of distortion and propaganda. Today, most opponents of CRT cannot accurately define it. Relying on social media and sound bites for information is not on par with academic discourse. A thorough understanding of CRT and any legitimate critique of it, which I do have legitimate critiques of it, is marred by smear campaigns. My colleagues and I will provide information on what CRT is and what it is not. Critical race theory is an academic idea that analyzes racism as being tied to institutions both historically and the present. It looks at racism through law and policy and is mostly taught in law schools and graduate schools. CRT originates from critical legal studies, a legal theory which analyzes law as intentionally maintaining the hegemonic structure that benefits the wealthy and powerful. Both critical race theory and critical legal studies affirm that law is not neutral, but rather preserves power structures. Critical race theory adds that racism is historically and presently a part of those power structures. In short, critical race theory is a focus on American law through the prism of race. CRT was an idea founded by Dr. Derek Bell in the 1970s, where he was Harvard Law's first black tenured professor. Bell's work looked at law and civil rights, where he was critical of whether civil rights laws truly moved the dial to racial justice. The information provided by Dr. Bell, as well as other CRT scholars such as Kimberly Crenshaw, Richard Delgado, and Jean Stefancic, all of which are faculty at various law schools around the nation, is intended for discourse at legal institutions and graduate programs. Opponents are now shifting the narrative from CRT being a legal approach to this new boogeyman, indoctrinating our youth to hate the United States and white children to abhor themselves. These opponents want to eliminate all narratives other than a sanitized view of American history in contemporary society. Using the term critical race theories, legislators across the nation are seeking to ban any type of analysis of systemic racism. Yet, when pushed to show evidence of it being taught or any malicious conversation on racism, the evidence is lacking, and oftentimes after seeing the testimonies of the previous individuals, it's just anecdotal. As a professor with 15 years of teaching and research experience in ethnic studies, I can truly say that CRT is not being taught at the undergraduate level. This is not because CRT is a fringe idea and not valid, but rather it is too advanced for students at that stage in their academic careers. And being that I teach an overwhelmingly white student body from small rural areas, I can affirm that students' interest in these topics and understanding these topics is very, very important. My goal is to provide them with the most accurate information and allow them to decide for themselves. The UW system, in understanding that many students do not have the tools to interact with diverse communities in their personal or professional lives, enacted a policy requiring students take one course that addresses race and ethnicity. Our students need to have these conversations and develop critical thinking and communication skills, cultural awareness, and a better understanding of power dynamics. Banning nuanced discussions of systemic racism, in my eyes, would be indoctrinating. And I thank you.
And now if Dr. Javier Tapia, I hope I said that correctly.
More or less.
More or less? Okay. Well, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Chairperson Roth and members of the committee. As mentioned, my name is Javier Tapia. I'm an associate professor in the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. But first, I want to begin with a personal story. I came to this country at the age of 13 with no knowledge of the English language. 90% of the student population was white, 5% Hispanic, 5% African American. 90% of the teaching and the school staff, primarily Caucasian. Now that I look back into the factors that shape educational attainment in the United States, I realize that I should have dropped out at the 10th or the 11th grade. I came here and I was placed in the 9th grade. But it was due to the support of two Mexican-American college students that came to my high school twice a week to help me and other students with our homework. with a Mexican-American woman, part-time librarian. She found me at the library. She supported me. The Mexican-American high school counselor found me. And they took me to the University of California, Riverside, where I got my bachelor's in anthropology. And if I had not been seen by those Mexican-American women, like I mentioned, I would not be here today. Many years now into the future, my work is primarily influenced by public anthropology. This is an example. Public anthropology, public sociology, university service. By Hispanic affairs and global educational studies. This shapes my work as an academic at the university. When we look into critical race theory, we see that it is a theory. It is an academic framework used at the university level to study, explore, and analyze social and racial equality and inequality in society, in the education sector, in the legal sector, health sector, or even into access to housing. For example, Professor William Argard at Harvard University, Professor Lincoln Quillian at Northwestern University have done quite a bit of research. And they find that in the last 40 years, there has been very little progress with respect to providing equality in obtaining loans for African American and Latino individuals. Taking into consideration credit history, income, loan mortgage, and neighborhood. So critical race theory explores the factors in society that undermine unequal access to housing, and it is through housing that people accumulate wealth. These forces often work in very subtle ways. Let me give you an example. 1920, women's right to vote. From their perspective and the reality, society was not providing them with equal opportunities in society. There was a group of people, primarily men, that did not see themselves as having an advantage in society by being able to vote and hold elected office. And it is these systems of analysis, critical race theory, could be gender studies, could be critical theory, they help us to explore all these forces so that we can have a better understanding of society and the natural world. In my experience, 20 plus years teaching in higher education, including the University of Pennsylvania a number of years ago, I did not see a particular course on critical race theory. Critical race theory can be incorporated as a component in sociology, ethnic studies, gender studies, and multicultural education. And as we put them all together, let me provide you with another example. In my experience at the university, 98% of all the students that want to become early childhood educators or in elementary education are female. 98%. Of more than 500 students, I had only had 2 male students planning to become early childhood educators. Meanwhile, when we look into the engineering school, presently only 21% of all the students enrolled in engineering programs across the United States are female. And so through these theories, through these frameworks, we try to understand, are women biologically, genetically more predisposed into early childhood education? Are men more biologically or genetically more predisposed to go into engineering? That's one question. The second question is, what are the salaries? Median salary for elementary educators, $55,000 a year. Median salary for people in engineering, $91,000. Even if you take into consideration the 3 months differential, 9 months versus 12 months, you still see an economic gap there. Multicultural education, ethnic studies, sociology, gender studies, and critical race theory help to develop a higher level of cognitive awareness, higher order thinking skills, and critical thinking skills. These skills are very important, for they tend to lead to a higher level of development, not only in cognitive skills, but in appreciating diversity and multicultural awareness. And this is very important. Having a minimum level of multicultural awareness is as important as reading, writing, math, and science. U.S. Census 2020. The United States is becoming more and more diverse. Businesses and corporations need to have their employees with a minimum level of knowledge to be able to function in a diverse environment. They may get their education here in Wisconsin, but they may end up working in Texas or in California. And it is this bodies of knowledge and skills that I refer to as multicultural awareness that are very important. They have allowed me in the past to work effectively with Governor Scott Walker, with former Congressmen Sean Duffy and Paul Ryan, in securing a Mexican consular office in the state of Wisconsin located in Milwaukee. It is this critical awareness, multicultural awareness, that are important in order to be able to work with people in the United States and to be able to work with people in Mexico and in other countries. And like I mentioned before, now they are a premium. All these fields of study in critical race theory promote greater equality in society. This is what we all want. This is what students in every single classroom in the United States every day, as they pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, for liberty and for justice for all. That's what we're trying to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now, Dr. John Zembrunin.
Well, Chairperson Roth, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify here today. My name's John Zembrunin. I've been teaching in the college classroom for about 25 years now, and I've worked at UW-Madison as a faculty member in the Department of Political Science for the last 13 years. Long before going off to become a political scientist and eventually finding myself in Madison, I was a 4-H kid in rural Wisconsin and the son of a county agent for the University of Missouri Extension Service. So for me, with that background, arriving in 2008 at a large public university with a deep commitment to the state it serves was and continues to feel like coming home. I continue to feel just ridiculously lucky every time I walk up Bascom Hill. In addition to being a faculty member, I currently serve as Vice Provost for Teaching and Learning. In that role, I work with colleagues across campus to provide support for UW's foundational mission of education. My appearance here today is largely in this campus administrative role, and I'm proud to represent my university in that capacity. But I'm still a faculty member. Within political science, I study political theory or political philosophy. Most of my published work's actually been on the ancient Greeks, but I teach a wide variety of things, and I'd say that my favorite course to teach is probably contemporary American political thought, a course in which my students and I read and discuss and often enough argue about thinkers from across the political spectrum in the United States and from throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. Given all that, I am first and foremost familiar with critical race theory in the same manner as my colleagues have discussed, as an argument made by legal scholars over the last 3 or maybe now 4 decades to the effect that racial bias and oppression are not, or at least not only, a matter of individuals being racist, but instead a matter of bias or oppression embedded in systems and processes and institutions. In the legal context, that argument would suggest that the issue is not, or at least not only, racist judges or lawyers or juries, but rather assumptions, processes, procedures, and institutional relationships that systematically disadvantage people of color. That core argument of CRT intertwines with various other threads of contemporary social theory, including in my own field of political theory. The CRT that's become a public flashpoint, though, doesn't really, or at least doesn't only, refer to these decades-old legal arguments from legal scholars, and I think we saw that in the earlier testimony today. As I understand it, CRT in our current public discourse refers to some related but broader and difficult and very important questions about how we grapple with race and racism in the United States, including in our schools and colleges and universities. CRT, to be clear, and I think the earlier witnesses would probably agree with this, in this broader sense doesn't refer to just any discussion of race. It focuses our attention particularly on those deep, challenging questions of individual agency versus systemic oppression. And just to be very clear, I know that there are many people who have widely divergent, very strongly held views on the answers to those questions. Again, generally, I would argue that the current debate isn't about critical race theory as a legal theory. It's instead about what and how we should be teaching about race and racism in the United States. And we do, of course, teach about race and racism at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We have almost 300 majors and certificates, over 9,000 courses, and more than 2,000 faculty. Critical theory in its narrow academic sense, as a legal theory, is taught in some but not nearly all of those majors and in some but not nearly all of those courses and by some but not nearly all of those faculty. And those broader questions about race and racism that CRT raises and that have become, I think, the subject of public debate, those broad questions about the relative role of individuals and systems or structures, those broader questions are raised and discussed and argued about in some of our majors and some of our classes. So let me put, if I can, the presence of those questions and those discussions and those arguments on our campus in a broader context. At UW-Madison, we talk about what we call the Wisconsin experience, which is our vision of the set of abilities that students should have that will help lead them to professional success, personal growth, responsible citizenship. We identify those capabilities as intellectual confidence, relentless curiosity, empathy and humility, and a commitment to purposeful action. Developing those qualities, getting there, being a UW-Madison alum, it isn't and it shouldn't be easy. It requires hard work. It sometimes involves doing things you don't want to do, and it can mean being uncomfortable. To be intellectually confident, relentlessly curious, to develop real empathy and humility, to orient yourself for a life of purposeful action, to do those things, you have to confront hard questions, you have to think in ways you haven't thought before, and you have to be challenged. At UW-Madison and throughout the UW system, we're committed to giving our faculty the academic freedom to create learning experiences to challenge students in these ways. At our best, when we teach about things like critical race theory, we're pushing our students and ourselves to be a little uncomfortable. That's where there's growth. That's where we learn. We learn not what to think, we learn how to think more clearly, more critically, more carefully. I could say that I do the same thing when I teach as I do Plato's Republic or Shakespeare's Hamlet. And that would be true. Plato and Shakespeare are great tools for producing discomfort. So is calculus, if I remember right. It's been a long time. So is physics. But I don't mean in saying that to suggest some false equivalency. I know that in our contemporary world, engaging with the broader questions that critical race theory raises is more fraught, more challenging than facilitating a discussion of Book One of the Republic. I can say that because I've done both of those things over the course of my career. As it celebrates academic freedom for instructors like me and encourages us to create challenging learning experiences for our students, UW-Madison, the UW system more broadly, also encourages instructors like me to create an atmosphere in and out of the classroom in which students can speak up and participate. Students who have concerns related to course content, to course activities, to coursework in general, can reach out to their instructor, to the department chair, to the dean, even to me as Vice Provost for Teaching and Learning to express their concerns, and I can tell you that they do reach out. Beyond that, our Dean of Students has a reporting process that provides an opportunity for any student who feels that they've been the subject of bias to have their concerns addressed. We work hard at UW-Madison to uphold the concept of free speech, and we take seriously any allegations of bias or mistreatment for articulating an opinion. Talking about race and racism, weighing up accounts of individual prejudice and systematic bias or oppression is hard work, and it is necessary work in our world today. But an institution like UW-Madison is meant to do the hard things. We like to talk at UW-Madison about the fearless sifting and winnowing of ideas until we get to the truth. Senator Nass mentioned that earlier. It's worth noting that it's both easy and basically meaningless to be fearless in sifting and winnowing when there's no discomfort or no risk. I trust my colleagues, I trust our students to do those hard things well, to take risks, to be a little fearless, to grow, even when we're considering the most vexing issues of our time. Thanks very much. Look forward to your questions.
I appreciate all of your testimony that you have provided us here. And, I just want to make the observation as we kind of close out this. I should have said at the onset, but there's so little opportunity in the world today or in our country today just to have honest discourse where people aren't shouting at each other. And that's why I think today is just a good example as we can bring people in and try and unpack complex thoughts and complex ideas. In the positions that all of you have, and when we go through the questions with committee members, I don't want everyone to feel like you have to answer every question, but certainly if you would like to. I think our first speaker just talked about a transition or a change, and I know none of you were around teaching in the 1960s, but he had mentioned that we had gone from this notion that a professor was more detached, and the whole goal was for that searching for scholarly truth, to today what he would describe as a more activist role in trying to implement change within society. Would you agree with that notion, or how do you guys see that, and however you all would care to answer?
Yes, Senator. I disagree with that individual. I think that the institution and the atmosphere of higher education where young people in their 20s are exposed to a different type of thought has been something that's been going on in the United States for quite some time. So higher education has historically been a place for fresh experiences for students that never got the type of education at their K through 12 level. And so it becomes a place where that thought, and I don't like using the term radical thought because I think people oftentimes associate radical thought with any type of Marxist boogeyman, once again, term. I think that becomes it just becomes a space for students. So there's been activism that's been taking place through higher education since, I look at examples in the 1960s. 1960s were a very, very radical time in colleges and institutions. So I don't think that's necessarily anything new. I think that right now, because of social media and being exposed to it, that people can pinpoint someone's free speech being taken away where there's a protest of a presenter. That same thing was happening in the 1960s with George Lincoln Rockwell, who was a founder of the Nazi Party in the United States, and people went and protested his discussions. guess what he said? He said, this is an infringement on my free speech. We should have more free speech. These activist teachers and these activist students are imposing on my rights to be able to spew my venom. And so I don't think that's anything new. I think that's just possibly the way higher education works in not just the United States, but other institutions as well, but other countries as well.
I largely agree with everything that my colleague said. A couple things I'd add. One is that I think we want to proceed with quite a lot of caution in making generalizations about college faculty. I've got 2,000 faculty colleagues at UW-Madison, and there's a lot of disagreement and difference of opinion amongst them about almost everything. Including politics, to the extent I even know my colleagues' politics, which it might surprise you to hear that in a political science department I can't necessarily tell you the politics of my colleagues. The other thing I would just say is any historical claim that universities today are more oriented towards activism and political conflict than they were at point X in the past is, to me, an almost impossible claim to sustain. Do we draw the line at maybe 1972 and say it's more activism on campus than in 1972? Maybe. I was 1 year old at the time. But the 1960s surely saw as much activism on all of our campuses, and surely at UW-Madison as they see today. And I don't want to be too cute in this next part of my response, but again, I study and teach about the ancient Greeks. Socrates and his cohorts in the 5th century BC were arguing about the nature of education and its relationship to society and its role in conserving or overturning societal norms and expectations. This is not new stuff in the world of higher education at all.
I tend to agree with my two colleagues, but I just want to point out is that we need to be talking about the same thing. What do we mean by activism? Is one type of behavior activism? Is another type of behavior not activism? So we have to be very clear what are we talking about. In a way, I do see myself as an activist. I see myself of using academic knowledge to make a practical impact in society, public anthropology, rich literature. And when I began to work in the Hispanic community in Milwaukee, I saw the many challenges the low-income Hispanic students face in the state. I found an organization by the name of Hispanics for School Choice, whose objective was, still is, but in a more limited form, to provide low-income Hispanic students with opportunities where they can experience greater educational success than those found in many of the public schools in Milwaukee. I have brought my knowledge about education to this organization, and sometimes I have invited some of my university students. We have had a number of activities to raise funds in order to provide families with a backpack, with school supplies for their children. And my students derive a sense of well-being, but it also brings them in closer contact with the parents in the community. So in that sense, I do consider myself an activist.
Senator Larson, did you have a question?
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate you each coming in to speak today at this informational hearing. And I appreciate right off the bat that there was clarification that critical race theory is not taught at any undergraduate level in any university in the state. I know that there was a hearing last month in the K-12 Education Committee where there was accusations and a conjecture that it is being taught in grade school. And of course, that is not reality. So I appreciate you clarifying that. That was one of my questions. I guess going through this as it's been outlined at this point in history, I'm curious if and you kind of touched on this, are there other points in history that that frankly mirror the current scapegoating of one particular theory and try and contort it as anything that references even close to the topic as being shoehorned in with this? As we're going through this, I've heard mention of times where there was that things seemed more activist. I'm curious if any of you have any specifics in terms of when you think that another point was so purposefully misunderstood for political purposes. And diving off that question, I've heard accusations of professors kind of going rogue. So if you don't each have to do this, but I'm curious if somebody can at least say if course content and structure are peer reviewed, or there is opportunity for individual professors to go off and produce their own thing without anybody knowing about it.
I might just respond to the second part of Senator Larson's question before thinking about the first some more. Can individual instructors go rogue? Does academic freedom mean that an individual faculty member can do whatever they want in their class? No. At an institution with 2,000 plus faculty, do some faculty members proceed differently in their classroom than I would or than other colleagues would? Absolutely, right? But just to speak a minute to some of the ways in which the curriculum and teaching are monitored and reviewed at UW-Madison. So any new course that's put on the books, whether it's a graduate seminar on critical race theory, which I don't believe we have on campus, but surely critical race theory is taught at the graduate level at my institution, or whether it's a course in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. When a new course is created, it goes through a rigorous review process at the department level, at the school college level, and at the university level. Syllabi are picked apart in that process. I can tell you as a faculty member, it's a fairly annoyingly rigorous process. Once courses are active and being taught, we heard a bit earlier about student evaluations of teaching. I'm happy to talk more about that if you like. But beyond student evaluations of teaching, we routinely have faculty members observing one another's teaching for purposes of assistant professor review, tenure and promotion review, post-tenure review. Folks' teaching is observed in a variety of different contexts. And as I mentioned, we also have different avenues where students can and do raise concerns about particular things going on in classrooms. So, absolutely, we value academic freedom and we take that incredibly seriously, but we also hold one another to account for our teaching.
And I would totally agree with you, John. I wanted to go back to the first question you had regarding any type of history that took place that reflects the controversy of the day. This is kind of relates to the discussion of critical race theory. In the 1960s, excuse me, one of my favorite historians, John Hope Franklin, wrote a book for a textbook for K through 12 that dismantled and critiqued the idea of the lost cause of the Civil War. And there was a huge blowback from conservatives saying that in the 1950s and 60s that this was going to teach white students to hate themselves and hate America. Excuse me, hate America. So that became a trend that we can connect to what's going on right now. But also prior to that, in probably maybe 10 years ago, there was a national outcry, particularly in Texas, particularly in Arizona and New Mexico, I do believe, or Nevada. But there was a critique in trying to outlaw ethnic studies courses. So trying to remove any discussion of race and systemic racism and giving students the experience that they have when they learn about Chicano culture, when they learn about Asian American identity. Trying to remove that, saying that it's a form of indoctrinating and also it's a form of teaching students to hate America. So this narrative that we're having right now is not anything new. Any type of criticism of systemic racism in our society winds up becoming this national narrative of we can't do this. So Texas, we look at Texas schools and the controversy that's taking place now where people are getting arrested for discussing critical race theory or getting fired. There's one principal from Texas that lost his job. He got it back because he didn't talk about critical race theory. He was talking about, he had a picture of him and his wife, who was white, kissing. And parents wanted him to be fired because of that. So when we look at these examples, that's not necessarily anything of controversial, but we create this narrative, or individuals create this narrative of trying to say that my identity as an American, we're getting rid of our traditions and our values are being attacked. And I think that winds up becoming the main focus of any type of controversy when we talk about systemic racism in our society.
Senator Larson, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, thank you. Those are thank you for talking about the kind of the on-ramp and the environment. I'm just curious, in practice, if there, and you've kind of alluded to this, some of you have alluded to this, when there is, the cognitive dissonance, or when a student doesn't objects to an issue being taught, or has strong feelings about it. And I guess you could deal with it in a hypothetical, but if there is a real example, I'm just curious, in your class, if there's a student who disagreed with the content of the course and or how it's being taught, how is that handled? How would you handle that, or how have you handled that in the past?
I can speak for UW-Platteville and the colleagues, particularly colleagues that are in areas similar to mine. We value our students' opinions. UW-Platteville is a largely conservative state. It's a STEM school, and it's also one of the few institutions that has a male majority population. And what we do is we give students a space to be able to give their ideas. What we do is we challenge them and tell them to come up with clear and concise information based off of their viewpoints, right? So we provide them information. We provide them what we think is pertinent for their education. If they have a disagreement, please, we urge them to come up with any type of factual and data-driven, and also, that is from information that is from peer-reviewed sources that may contradict what we are saying. I encourage that. I tell students, and I also, in all my assignments, I give them a space and say, what do you think about this? Do you agree or disagree? And tell me why. And I want the why. That's the key thing. I want them to be critical thinkers. They don't have to agree with me, but they do have to think.
If I can just follow up on that, I've seen something similar with my colleagues and myself at UW Milwaukee, that when we are discussing certain topics and certain issues, and some of them may create some type of cognitive dissonance, and the idea there is not to look for a right or a wrong answer, but for the student to have an opportunity, like you mentioned, to bring data, to bring information from different sources in order to support a particular position or another position. And of course, That's the foundation for higher order thinking skills and critical thinking skills. And if they put in the effort, they should be rewarded for that effort.
If I could just add quickly, before taking on my current role, I was chair of the Department of Political Science, and you can imagine that chairing a Department of Political Science, you occasionally get concerns from a variety of different sources about what's being taught. That's students, but that's various people. And you take those concerns seriously, and I'm thinking and trying not to refer too much to specific cases because we want to respect students' confidentiality, but a couple different cases where students honestly went to social media with concerns about things that were on syllabi, right? First of all, of course, we would prefer that they come talk to the instructor before going to social media, but people do what they do in our contemporary world. And I would tell you that in both of those instances, and again, without going into much detail, what I was struck by on the part of my colleagues who were being called out on social media in what, frankly, were some inaccurate and unfair ways, their first response was, "Can the student please come talk to me?" And their second response from both of them was a very strong, let's make sure in responding to this that we don't do anything that disparages the student. Let's make sure that we protect the student's confidentiality if we can. The people I work with care about their students, right? Even when their students disagree with them, even when their students are pushing back, and frankly, at times saying some things that aren't entirely accurate or fair.
Senator Nass.
I'll just say I appreciate two of the three of you, your comments and laying out. I may not necessarily agree with everything, but at least you've stated where you are on CRT without name calling and belittling the opposition. Thank you. Thank you.
Senator Staffschulte, did you have a question? Senator Royce, did you have a question?
No, thank you.
Senator Fine.
Thank you for being here today. I had to step out for a meeting, so I plan to watch your testimony. It's on Wisconsin Eye, so I will be able to see it. And if I have any follow-ups, I know how to get a hold of you. So thank you.
Senator Darling.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. I really appreciate your thoughts and your being willing to share your ideas with us. A question I have for all of you, I guess there are two questions, would be if we as the United States, our founding fathers wanted us to be unified and wanted us to understand that we had a very diverse beginning. We had renegades coming from all over the world because they wanted to be free and they wanted to have opportunity. And this unity was very important in our history, and it still is. And the question is, critical race theory has been acknowledged by almost every speaker here as an academic intellectual framework, as Professor Tapias has said, to explore and analyze racial inequity in our society. A key element of the theory is that society's legal, economic, educational institutions operate often in subtle ways to marginalize racial and ethnic minority populations. So this is what is trying to be accomplished, to look at that concept. And in doing that, many school districts and many individuals address that in different ways. And my question to you would be, we talked about the need to have our students be able to know and have skills to be able to go out into the real world and so they can have opportunity and freedom to have the kind of life that they desire. And of course, we're not all going to have the same abilities and talents, but we all have the dignity and opportunity. My question would be, putting the emphasis, like Dr. King, you are the head of the Department of, you're the professor in in ethnic studies, and you are head of the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. If we look at the way we're spending our time and money in education, especially higher ed, are we getting the best we can get out of our education by not being unified in what we expect our college students to be able to know and be able to do as a result of their education? Often, many of them acquire a lot of debt. Often, many of them don't know what they're going to do. I'm just wondering, how would you address the issue of how we're using our finances, our resources for higher ed right now? And if you look at our performance in the world, we have gone from being in the top 5 of nations down below the top 20. And in some cases, in some study areas, much lower than that. So I go back to the question, are we using our resources the best we can right now to make sure our students are learning what they need to know and be able to do, and knowing that we have to address the issues of being together and unified and have to address the issues of racism, but are we using our resources in the best way so that we can go forward as a state and forward as a country? Long way to ask a question, sorry.
Thank you for that question, Senator. I would have to first say that from official capacity, I am not one of the leader of the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. I am just one person. I'm one person as part of the Division of DEI. I just have the title of, there's 3 executive directors, and then we also have the Vice Chancellor of Diversity, and I work under her. So I wanted to, the question you have is very, very complex, because I think it's a larger scale other than looking at DEI type of curriculum, but programs. I think it's more of an overall national issue that we're having regarding higher education, particularly when it comes to student loan debt. And I'm so glad that you brought that up, because we can look at, when we look at critical race theory, or not critical race theory, but an analysis of race, we can see that communities of color face more higher debt from student loans. So we can look at that and analyze and say there's a larger scale problem when it comes to that. So I think we have to look at and have a national dialogue about this. And we could try to find ways that is going to alleviate any type of assistance. I know at UW-Platteville, we have been, because it's a very working class type institution, a lot of our students aren't necessarily come from affluent backgrounds. So we try to give resources to students, all of our students across the board, and trying to help our students financially, give assistance. We were granted some awards for financial rewards to help students, to ensure that we can make it as affordable as possible for our students.
If I may, that's a very good but complex question, Senator Darling. As I mentioned, all students need to have the foundations. They need to have the reading, the writing, the science, and the math. But they also need to have a foundation on multicultural awareness that in my testimony I stated that is a premium nowadays. What are the skills for the jobs of today, and what are the skills of the jobs for tomorrow? With the impact that technology is having in our society, a number of people are writing and talking about lifelong learning, in that it's no longer going to be possible for an individual to spend 30, 40, 50 years in one particular job, as many of them will be moving every 2 or 3 years from one occupation to another occupation. And so the question becomes, what are the basic skills that will facilitate individuals a better adaptation as they move from one field to another field? And we are still exploring that question.
So I'm smiling underneath my mask because I'm trying to just kind of hold myself back on the Founding Fathers thing, because that's so totally what I teach about. So I'm going to bracket that for a minute, Senator Darling, and come back to it. But in terms of I think your question that we should all be asking all the time, and I think, members of this committee, members of the state senate in general should be asking this, which is like, are we spending our resources in the best way possible for our system of higher education? Look, I think the answer to that is in the abstract and in an academic sense always going to be no, right? Like, there are always ways we could do better, and we should be pushing ourselves to do better. At the same time, and here's my administrator hat coming on, so apologies for bragging about my institution, but we're doing pretty well as an institution. We are ranked among the top research institutions in the world. I think my boss, the provost, would be beside himself if I didn't mention that one particular publication in the last 2 weeks rated us in the top 5 of higher education institutions in the U.S., just ranking Harvard, actually. So there, I've checked that box for my boss. We have incredibly high graduation rates. The average time to degree at UW-Madison is less than 4 years. Over half of our students graduate with no debt. And our student default rate is 1 or 2%, something like that. So in general, I'd say we're doing pretty good, and of course we could do better. I do want to come back to, and I know on some level, Senator Darling, that really wasn't the answer you were looking for, the question you were asking, but professional obligation over here in some sense. I think the really more interesting and harder aspect of that question is, are we graduating students who are ready for the world today? Mm-hmm. And that's a really hard and evolving question. I'm in the tank enough for the liberal arts as a political scientist and political theorist that I am remarkably resistant to arguments that everything a college student learns has to be immediately relevant. If that were true, they wouldn't let me teach about the progressives of the early 20th century or about the early post-World War II arguments among American conservatives, right? Like, there just are things that students need to learn about and teach that they're not going to use on job X in year Y, but are going to enrich their lives. Can't resist going back to the founding fathers and your claim, your suggestions, your question about unity. When we start thinking about unity at the American founding, it's hard not to go to the Latin e pluribus unum, out of many one, which I think pushes us towards unity but preserves the plurality. And I will just tell you, when I teach American political thought, that tension between plurality or diversity or difference in the language we might use today and unity in American political thought and American political history is just a core theme and controversy that I try to get my students to engage with from every possible direction I can. I mean, alongside the this is a kind of classical Republican desire for unity, there's James Madison in Federalist Paper number 10 saying the best way to deal with divisive factions in a society is to have a great big society where there's as many factions as we can get so no one of them can rule, right? So I don't mean to go off on like a lecture tangent there, but I can't resist a little bit. But I think in some ways, right, we're continuing to find our way through that tension between unity and division, or unity and diversity. And I mean, I guess the last thing I'll say before I get off my soapbox is just the language of divisiveness. I will say that as a college level instructor, I think part of my job is not to shy away from topics that my students will disagree with, or disagree with me about, that will be kind of divisive amongst them. I think the issue is more divisiveness for the sake of divisiveness, right? Where you might get me kind of pushing back and saying, are we doing that? And I genuinely do not think that happens to a significant extent at UW-Madison, that it's divisiveness for the sake of divisiveness. Taking on challenging, difficult issues that produce a lot of disagreement and sometimes a lot of heat and not so much light, sure, that happens. And that is, in some ways, a byproduct of having a truly awesome state university.
Thank you.
Thank you. I Skipped over Senator Staffschul too quickly. We have issues with the muting and unmuting of these microphones. He sent in his question that I'll read to you. It had been said that CRT is not taught except at the graduate level. Would you agree then that it is inappropriate to teach in an undergrad program, especially like a K-12 setting?
So I'll jump in there, and I draw the line in answering this question based on my own expertise between K-12 and undergraduate, right? So I'm not going to particularly weigh in on undergrad. My expertise about K-12 education is limited to my time as a student and my role as the father of 4 children. At the undergraduate level, I would agree with what my colleague said, that critical race theory is rarely taught at the undergraduate level. You'll hear me being a little bit careful there. There are advanced courses in political theory or social theory where I could imagine a reading from a legal scholar from the 1970s or 1980s that's a founding piece in critical race theory being assigned. I'm honestly, in preparing for this hearing, I've tried to think if I've ever assigned something that would get lumped in as a critical race theory. I don't know that I've assigned, any of those sort of key figures in critical race theory. In the right upper level undergraduate small seminar, I will just be honest, I wouldn't hesitate to assign some of that work. It wouldn't be to assign that work as like the truth. It would be to assign that work as part of an array of readings that we would get together about and critically interrogate, because that's what we do at that level. So mostly not at the undergraduate level. Occasionally these ideas are considered at the undergraduate level, sure. I think a lot there hinges on what we mean by taught, right? Like taught doesn't mean indoctrinate. Taught means let's put this on the table and argue about it.
I can't speak on for undergrad, Senator. I think, or not undergrad, but I think for K through 12, one thing I do think is any analysis of law would be very difficult to talk about from the K through 12 aspect. I always use this example of, is this critical race theory or not? So I talk about the Constitution a little bit, and I talk about certain amendments, 13th, 14th, 15th, the 17th, 19th, and I look at those from the aspect of have they alleviated any type of discrimination, particularly when it comes to voting rights. So we have a episode on a discussion on voting. How do we do that from a K through 12 perspective in a way that could talk about the nuances of Constitution topics and still bring in any type of discussion of race? So we could say, talk about the Civil War from a K through 12 perspective, and then bringing in the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments, which took place after the Civil War during Reconstruction. We can bring that in. Is that necessarily critical race theory? Are we talking about analysis of race? Yes. And connecting it to Constitution. Is that critical race theory from the areas that I look at, from the perspective I look at? No, it is not. So I would say critical race theory may not work for K through 12, but analysis and discussion about the nuances of race in our society and our history is definitely essential for a K through 12 experience.
I have to agree with my 2 colleagues. I have seen in graduate courses and also in some undergraduate courses the incorporation of critical race theory, maybe out of 16 weeks in a semester, maybe 1 lecture day, maybe an article or 2. But like I mentioned before, it's not discussed in isolation. It is discussed in a combination with ethnic studies, the sociology of education, multicultural education. And if students are going to develop a better understanding of society and the world, I think that these bodies of knowledge should be presented in K-12, especially social studies in high school, but it will depend on the competency of the instructor, how she goes about presenting the material and leading the discussion, and the reception is also going to vary. What is the student population? What is the demographic makeup of the student population and the families in that particular community? My sense is that they are going to interpret what's being taught in the school in different ways.
I want to thank you, gentlemen, for your time here. That concludes the questions here from the committee. This also concludes the informational hearing today. At this time, we'll begin the public hearing. We will have the roll taken at our public hearing be applied to, the roll taken at the informational hearing will now be applied to the roll at the public hearing. We are going to take items off of the agenda up and down based on the discretion of the chair, and we are going to start with hearing testimony on Senate Bill 313, of which I am an author, but just with some commitments I have to do jumping around the building here. Representative Shay Sortwell is going to come and talk to us about that bill. Welcome, Representative.
Thank you very much, Chairman and members of the committee. And as the chairman already knows, this is a fantastic bill. That's why he helped me write it. So members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity. Basically, what Senate Bill 313 does is it relates to the technical college fees covered that are not currently covered under the Wisconsin GI Bill. So enacted in 2005, Wisconsin GI Bill is a state of Wisconsin program that provides tuition and segregated fee benefits for qualifying Wisconsin veterans, spouses, and other eligible spouses of eligible veterans, and surviving spouses, etc. So usually, and what occurs with the UW system is that both tuition and fees are covered. However, there are certain, and then to quote it, certain student activity and incidental fees that are set by the Wisconsin technical colleges that are not covered under the Wisconsin GI Bill. Now, I don't know if this was an oversight when it was originally drafted back in 2005, or if for some reason they just wanted to keep it out in the first place. But basically, as we're looking at this situation was brought forward to me by one of my constituents who he did write some written testimony, and basically he pointed out that, well, why are we treating segregated fees at the UW different from segregated fees at the college system, the technical college system? And so he found this out himself when he started getting billed by the technical college, and he thought his tuition was completely paid for. So we want to support our veterans and integrate them into the workforce more quickly, more efficiently, and as was actually noted by the American Legion, who is in support of this bill, they had noted to me that the workforce shortages tend to actually be higher in veterans in the trades, which are our technical college trainings, versus degrees that you would theoretically get through the UW system. And so this bill would incorporate the student activity and incidental fees into the GI Bill to expand coverage for them. And I do have a list. I don't know if we included it in our testimony, but we have a list of different types of incidental fees that are included that I do have. Just as an example, for instance, at several colleges, several of the technical colleges, they have a 6% tuition per 6% of the tuition per credit per semester is just a fee tacked on, and this is not currently covered under the Wisconsin GI Bill, and they go towards spending different things on the college campuses. So they got 6% tuition at Southwest, 6% tacked on at Mid-State. Waukesha County Technical doesn't have a specific percentage, but you know they do have their fees that are not covered under the GI Bill. So there's a number of these fees at all these different technical colleges. So I appreciate any support from this committee in moving this forward. I understand that we will be moving it forward in the Assembly in the next couple of weeks, and I hope we can see the same thing over in the Senate. So with that, I'll be happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. The question I have, whether of yourself or Ledge Council, when I look at this, and I will preface this by saying, as a veteran, I get into some discussion with veterans, and I get frustrated, to be quite frank and honest, with some that ask for a fishing license or a park sticker. And my position is stop asking for the candy. There are bigger issues such as education, health care, disability coverage, so many other things that really make a difference in a veteran's life. So with this, and it's a simple question, it's referred to, I'm assuming it's similar, the UW system and the tech school. It refers to, at the UW system, cost of tuition and fees, and at the tech school is tuition and segregated fees. Is there any significant difference, or are they really talking the same thing? Don't know, or either way.
I don't know. I think the segregated fees incorporates a larger number of items with the UW system than what we're talking about here with the tech colleges.
Okay, so okay.
If you're talking about it in general.
Yep. Okay, very good, thank you. Questions from members. We'll start with Senator Larson. Any questions on this bill? Senator Erpenbach? Go ahead. No? Senator Erpenbach? No. Stachel? Royce? Pfaff? And Senator Darling?
No.
Nope, we're good. Thank you.
Appreciate all your time. Thank you for your support.
And then James Zylstra, Wisconsin Technical College System, testifying for information only. Welcome.
Thank you, Senator. This will be very brief. So technical colleges are proud that we have served over 9,000 veteran students annually. Additionally, over 2,000 veterans, spouses, and dependents attend technical colleges under the Wisconsin GI Bill each year. WTCS has supported the original Wisconsin GI Bill and subsequent amendments to the program. Historically, the appropriation for this program has funded less than 20% of the cost of the program. The colleges have adopted the rest. So the one thing we would ask for is if the legislature would be interested in providing additional resources to help support the program going forward. Otherwise, we are supportive of it, but it would be great to have some resources. I think the fiscal estimate mentions that we estimate it'll cost about $260,000 to have these additional benefits next year.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
It'll quit soon.
Yep, it'll stop.
It never quits. Yeah, that's true. So the funding of this, here we go. 20%, you said?
It's a little less than 20% is covered by the state. There's a state appropriation that is shared between us and UW system, and then the funds are prorated based on the number of veterans and the reimbursement costs. So roughly last year, I believe the state reimbursed us about 15% of the cost of the program, and the rest was funded by the colleges.
Okay, and I'm looking quickly and whether Ledge Council would have it. I'm looking at the fiscal note just to compare with what the university system, unless you know off the top.
I don't know theirs off the top of my head.
Okay, obviously what their reimbursement and yours.
This should be the same percentage, I would think, since it's just prorated based on the total cost for both of us.
Okay, all right. I don't know. Thank you. Are there, rather than run through the list, if anyone does have a question regarding this particular bill, Senate Bill 313, let me know. Go ahead. No questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator.
Layla Merrifield, Technical College System Board Association, testifying for information only. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'll be hopefully just as brief as Jim. Speaking on behalf of the local college boards, I just want to emphasize the depth of our commitment to military-connected families and students. So Jim mentioned that we serve 9,000 military-connected folks every year that we know about who have self-reported that they are either veterans themselves or students who are the dependents or spouses of veterans, or those who are actively serving, who are current National Guard, reserves, et cetera. And our colleges, recognizing this number of students on campus, have done things to really best serve those students, just as we try to well serve all of our students who come to us, regardless of their needs, right? So if that's that they're academically disadvantaged, that they're economically disadvantaged, we try to allow for that in the services that we provide. And military-connected students are no different. So that might look like having specific, counselors or advisors on campus who have military backgrounds themselves and can therefore kind of speak the language, understand the forms, understand the military culture, and properly advise these students on how to access their GI Bill benefits, whether that's Montgomery Bill, whether that's post 9/11, whether that's Wisconsin GI Bill, et cetera. But it also sometimes looks like, student clubs for students who are military connected, or perhaps even private spaces on campus, maybe a quiet room where you feel safe and you feel as though you can study, you can connect with your fellow students who have similar backgrounds. So my point being that those things take resources. And so to Jim's point, we would certainly appreciate the legislature just taking a look at that reimbursement and thinking seriously about the resources that we have both invested in our student veterans and military-connected families, and also what the state's role should be in terms of subsidizing or helping to fund that program.
When I look at the fiscal note, that portion of the $266,000 would be arguably, if some of that would come back because you would be reimbursed for that, is what you're saying.
I believe so. I didn't write the fiscal estimate,
Yeah,
but
no
I
problem.
assume that that's the case.
I think, yeah, okay, gotcha. So it's, okay, so we'll have a figure, and representative of the author will have a figure also, which helps zero in on that. So,
appreciate it.
questions from the committee, here or listening in? Thank you.
Thanks.
That concludes that particular legislation. We are now into the appointments. And the first is Ashley Edgerson. Ashley, welcome. Nominated as a public member to the College Savings Program Board to serve a term ending May 1st of 2024. You're from Milwaukee. Program manager for the City of Milwaukee's Fund My Future Milwaukee program. Welcome.
Yes, thank you for having me. So good afternoon. First, I'd like to thank members of the College Savings Board for nominating me for a seat, and to the members of Senate for hearing me this afternoon. My passion for advancing students of color through secondary education and increasing retention rates in predominantly white institutions began while I was attending the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh. After establishing a mentorship program with women of color on UW's campus, I began to explore other ways to advocate for minorities and low moderate income families and students to achieve an education. As the program director for Fund My Future Milwaukee, it is my responsibility to educate our families about the future ahead. We work diligently to increase educational attainment for our students and increase financial stability in our communities. I have made it my mission to create spaces where everyone is safe, valued, and respected while obtaining an education in their surrounding communities. Through my role at Fund My Future Milwaukee and earning a seat with the College Savings Board, I remain committed to cultivating meaningful cross-sector relationships and partnerships with an emphasis in equity, diversity, and inclusion throughout the state of Wisconsin's education system. Thank you so much for your time.
Questions? Any questions from the committee? This is a tough one. Okay, well, thank you very much. Appreciate your coming here before the committee. Dr. Daniels, public member on the Technical College Board to serve for a term ending May 1st, 2023. You are from Madero, assistant professor in the School of Education at North Central University and originally a accredited online university. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. I'm just right. Okay. Good afternoon. I first want to thank the committee for taking time out of their busy schedule to meet with me. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to serve the citizens of Wisconsin. While I'm originally from Texas via the United States Army, I was very quick to move from San Antonio to Mindoro, Wisconsin, after transitioning from the U.S. Army. The one area that the military has taught me is that when things need to get done, we work together. To get this mission accomplished, I did this as a logistics and budget officer and as a commander of a forward deployed unit in the Republic of Germany. I've served during the first Gulf War, deployed to Mogadishu, Somalia, and served the Bosnia-Herzegovina mission in Europe. It did not matter your political affiliation. Taking care of people and getting the mission accomplished was the focus of our work. I'm a well-rounded person in terms of working with the citizens of Wisconsin. Having been a special education teacher and a K-12 principal, I have taught as an instructor in the Wisconsin Technical College system for 9 years prior to becoming a university professor. I've seen the growth of the adult learners in Wisconsin leading to graduation and how they do very well for employers. My personal and professional experiences have helped me to understand the variety of challenges that students have and understanding how curriculum applies to what they do. Enhancing support for teachers so they may do the job that they are paid to do. And providing community stakeholders with partnerships to build relations between technical colleges and local communities that we serve. The power of a quality education changes lives. And I have been the recipient of how education moved a person who did not have the greatest background growing up. Living homeless twice as a child to seeing what opportunities education can provide. The technical college system in Wisconsin changes the lives of everyday citizens and provides the opportunity to achieve more and contribute to the communities in which they live. I look forward to answering your questions and having the citizens of Wisconsin learn more about me in the process. Thank you.
Appreciate you being here this afternoon now. Appreciate your willingness to serve also on the board. I'm just wondering if you could share with us maybe some observations on what you think the tech college system is doing well and what you think it might be able to improve upon.
Okay. Well, what we do is that we get the education and change lives in terms of how we get people to be certified for businesses, for getting the students actually all the things they need to be a productive member of society. And oh, by the way, we have enough where we build relationships within the community with the students that graduate. So we're usually well received by the communities that we serve. Areas that can be improved, we always like to be able to say, well, with anything with tuition, we always like to have that a little lower so students can actually be available and they have things that work well to make sure costs are down. But we can always improve that.
Senator Larson, did you have a question?
Not at this time, thank you.
Senator Nass, did you have a question? Senator Royce, did you have a question?
No, thank you.
Senator Darling?
No. Just have to say thank you for your service.
Oh, thank you.
Hi.
I apologize, Senator.
No, you don't have to apologize to me for anything ever.
I didn't see you there, but
Yeah.
the esteemed Senator Erpenbach.
Thank you. Okay, so Texas to Mindoro
That's
to be
correct.
a sheep farmer. That's your background?
That's correct.
Okay, and you have how many kids?
Oh, boy. Okay. Actually, we have 11 children.
Okay, all right.
So-
And okay, so you're teaching, and you're a sheep farmer, and you have 11 kids. Some at home, some not.
Oh, yeah, half of them are adults. Finally.
Are you from Texas originally?
San Antonio.
Okay.
So
how Wisconsin?
I was stationed over at Fort McCoy for when we were bringing all the equipment back from Fort McCoy.
Okay.
And as soon as I got around that area, I was like, oh, this is good. When I retire, this is where I want to be.
Okay.
So,
Well,
a little colder than when I first started. I was
yeah,
like,
it was.
oh, my.
It's only cold for like 2 or 3 days, and then it warms back up again. Well, thanks for coming to Wisconsin, and good luck with everything.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Daniels. We appreciate your time. We are going to, I'm now going to ask Senator LaTanya Johnson. Oh, there you are. Senator LaTanya Johnson, welcome. Senator Johnson comes from the 6th District in Milwaukee. She was nominated to serve as a public member on the College Savings Program Board to serve for a term ending May 1st, 2025. So welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Do you have any comments you wanted to share with the committee?
Well, I guess so. You've already said my name. I'm Senator LaTanya Johnson. I just want to say that it is a privilege to be appointed to this board. As a first generation college grad, I understand the importance of making college affordable. I also understand that as a first generation college grad, when you get that diploma, that degree, you don't just get to go off and enjoy your own life. You get to reach back and help your family and help other community members. Affordability is huge. It's one of the main factors that so many of our African American children don't attend college. And even sometimes those that do, those balances prevent them from being able to go back. And as a first generation college student, sometimes you don't have the family or the resources available to help out with the education the way that you wanted to. So being able to bring that perspective to this board is extremely, extremely important for me. And just being able to learn so many of the things that the board has to offer has been very exciting and also humbling to be in that to have this opportunity.
Well, we appreciate, I know how it is as legislators serving on these boards, but it's good for us, I think, to have the perspective to be able, you're kind of an embed out there on the College Program Savings Board, and then you're able to bring that insight back to the legislature. I don't have a specific question for you, but I will defer to other senators to see if they do. Senator Larson, did you have a question?
No, I don't want to put our colleagues on the hot seat. I feel like we talked to them enough, but appreciate you, Senator Johnson. Look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you.
Senator Nass? No. Senator Erpenbach? No. Senator Staffschall? Senator Royce?
No, thank you.
Congratulations, Kelda.
Thanks.
And Senator Darling? No, thank you. Thank you so much, Senator Johnson, for being here.
Thank you.
At this time, the committee will invite up Brianna Tucker. Brianna Tucker was nominated to serve as the traditional student representative on the Board of Regents for the term ending May 1st, 2023. She is from Stevens Point. I understand that you are a sophomore studying political science and Spanish. Thank you for being here, and invite you at this time to share some comments with the committee.
Thank you. Chairman and members of the Senate Committee on Universities and Technical Colleges, I am pleased and honored to stand before you today to tell you about myself, my background, and my interest in serving on the Board of Regents.
If I can just, I apologize for interrupting, but is that green light on your button?
This button.
It's the...
Oh.
Perfect. Thank you.
Sorry, should I start over?
Yes, if you would, please. Thank you.
Of course. Chairman and members of the Senate Committee on Universities and Technical Colleges, I am pleased and honored to stand before you today to tell you about myself, my background, and my interest in serving on the Board of Regents of the University of Wisconsin system. I was born and raised in the Milwaukee area, and after finishing my high school degree in South Milwaukee, I now attend UW Stevens Point for my four-year degree. I am pursuing my degree in political science with now 2 minors in criminal justice and Spanish. I am a senator of the UW Stevens Point government. I am a member of the Latino Student Alliance. I worked as a peer mentor for incoming 2021 fall students. I was president of the College Democrats and also served as the vice president of the UWSP Residential Hall Association. Since being appointed as a regent, I have scaled back my involvement in these student organizations and activities to dedicate more time to being a member of the board. After graduating in what I hope is 3 years, I plan to take a gap year to work in a law firm as a paralegal for work experience. Then I hope to graduate law school and become a family lawyer. My leadership and involvement on campus made me a fine candidate for the position on the Board of the Regents. The relationships, connections, and collaborations I formed and took part in got me very connected to not just my campus, but the entire UW system. This is what ultimately piqued my interest in the Board of Regents and led to my appointment. I come to the work as a regent with an open mind, willing to listen to anything and everything. I am the voice and representative of students, as well as a channel for shared governance. As far as my interest in serving, I would like to see the betterment of the system for students across the state. I would like to collaborate with each campus, especially with the student governments, to see what their biggest challenges are and how, as a system, we can help. I would like to accomplish this by visiting campuses and meeting student governments to hear their concerns and help find the best possible solutions. I also would like to collaborate with the student governments to schedule monthly meetings where all 13 campus governments can come together and voice their opinions and updates. This is already in the works, as I have been in contact with my campus student body president. I also want to see the diversity and enrollment of minority/underrepresented students increase on campus, as well as the retention of all students to increase. I believe a way this can be done is by investing more money into scholarships. Also, by stressing the importance of resources for all students to continue their higher education in the UW system. Thank you for your time and listening to what I hope was an insightful view of who I am and what I intend to do. I look forward to questions.
Thank you so much for being here. Just wondering if you could describe to us how your experience on the board has gone so far, and then maybe outline what you think might be the biggest challenge you see for the university system in your capacity as a regent.
Yes, so thank you for your question, Chairman Roth. My experience with the Board of Regents so far has been one that is pleasant. It is overwhelming meeting so many new people and being thrown into this so quickly, but I do enjoy it every second. And meeting new people and forming these relationships has been really a pleasant experience overall. I do look forward to getting to know how the procedures go and how to work on this board more coherently, as well as the biggest challenge in the UW system. I believe it would be affordability. I think this is something many students, especially students of color or with a non-affluent background, struggle with in attending higher education and pursuing it and getting to graduation, which is why one of my biggest goals is to help with the affordability aspect.
Senator Larson, did you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for putting yourself forward to be on the Board of Regents. I am curious, and you kind of touched on this. I'm curious if you have any specifics to be able to share with the committee and/or things you're looking to share with the Board of Regents about retention for students of color. I represent UW-Milwaukee, and it has the highest percentage of students of color. But unfortunately, there's also a huge drop-off after students' first year, and it's higher among students of color. So it's something I talk to the administration there regularly. I talk to students about it regularly, and I'm curious, as you are seated at the Board of Regents, if you have ideas or any ideas on how to be able to tackle that problem with not just recruitment, but with retention, to make sure we have a good diverse field of graduates coming out of the UW.
Yes, thank you, Senator Larson, for the question. As I mentioned before, one of the biggest things I believe is a challenge in the UW system is affordability, and investing more money into scholarships and giving it to these underprivileged students, whether it be of any race, any background, or any beliefs, that these students can then prevail and graduate in in our system, as well as stressing the importance of knowing resources on your campus. I think our UW system does a great job at allowing resources available to every student to be used to the fullest extent, and many students do not know about most of these resources, so I think stressing where they can find it and how they can utilize it properly will also help with the retention of students.
Senator Nass, did you have a question? Okay. Senator Erpenbach?
No.
Senator Staffschult? Senator Royce?
No, thanks.
Senator Fine? Senator Darling?
I do have one question. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Brianna, thank you for being here, and thank you for being willing to serve. Question for you. We have many students who are in fields that we don't have a lot of need for in our state. And then we have a lot of students who have a lot of debt, but we have a lot of jobs in other areas. Do you think we need to do more career development to assess skills and abilities and make sure students are going on paths that they can meet their needs and skills and have the opportunity to go into really good jobs and stay in Wisconsin? Do you think there's a need for more career development?
I think we can always improve on career development and allowing students to find their fullest potential in what they could possibly do in their future, as well as there being students in fields that are too small and students in fields that are too big. As important as each field is, I feel as though going off of the career development improvement would also help with this problem, I assume, to allow students to focus in on what they really think they should do.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brianna, for being with us here today. That concludes your questions from the committee.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, and last on our agenda here is Senator Alberta Darling. You can stay right there if you want to. We're not going to make you walk all the way down. But Senator Darling, colleague of all of us, nominated to serve as a public member on the College Savings Program Board to serve for a term ending on May 1st, 2025. Did you have any comments for us?
I would like to make just a few brief comments. I was very happy that I could serve with Rick Grobschmidt, who was a senator then, to lead on creating the EdVest board, because we wanted to get more students in Wisconsin the opportunity to go to college, but also for adults to save to be able to use that money to go to college, because we have many adult students who have not finished their degrees or haven't even started. So I'm very happy to say right now, since December 2020, we have $4.2 billion in that fund, which is awesome, and allows a lot of people to have that savings there. And that money compounds itself, so if a parent or an adult starts saving before they have to go, they can really accrue a lot of money to help them pay their tuition and fees without having to go into debt. So I'm very proud of the program, and thank you for your consideration.
Senator Larson, did you have a question?
No, I'll hold the same as I did with Senator Johnson. Thank you, Alberta, for serving, or sorry, Senator Darling, for serving and looking to do a good job on this. We appreciate it.
Senator Larson.
Senator Nass.
Pass.
Senator Erpenbach.
You know anything about sheep farming?
No, not a thing.
Okay.
Senator Staffschult. Senator Royce.
No, thanks.
Senator Fine.
No, I'm good.
Senator Darling, thank you so much. I just want to mention that Zach Madden, the office of Governor Evers, has registered in favor of Dr. Daniels, Ashley Edgerson, and Brianna Tucker. Oh, excuse me, there's a few more. Catherine Haberland from DFI registers in favor of Ashley Edgerson, Senator Johnson, Senator Darling. And Linda Lambert from DFI registers in favor of Ashley Edgerson, Senator Johnson, and Senator Darling. So that concludes both the public hearing and the informational hearing. I thank all the senators for being here and for what you've brought to the committee. We are adjourned.
This This program is a production of Wisconsin Eye, an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit media network with a mission to inform, educate, and engage the citizens of Wisconsin. Wisconsin Eye is the nation's first and only independently funded state civic broadcast network, providing gavel-to-gavel access to government proceedings and events at the state capitol.